There is a moment in the second season finale stretch of Gravity Falls where Stan Pines slips behind a hidden panel in his own gift shop, walks down into a basement that has been there the whole time, and quietly admits that the man you have been watching for the better part of 2 years is not exactly who he has been telling you he is. It is one of the most satisfying twists in modern animation, and if you sit with it for even a minute, it also opens up a small ocean of questions that the show never quite gets around to closing. Tonight on Pine Hat, we are going through every one of them, every loose thread, every quietly impossible bit of timing, every contradiction that fans have been picking at for the last decade, and we are doing it the way Gravity Falls itself liked to do things, slowly and with a flashlight. So get comfortable, turn the lights down, we will be here a while, and if you have not subscribed yet, it really does help us keep making these. The thing to understand before we go any further is that Gravity Falls is a show that almost gets away with everything. It was built by Alex Hirsch in a very small writer's room across roughly 4 years, between 2012 and 2016, and it ran for exactly 2 seasons of 20 episodes each, plus a small constellation of shorts. That is a tiny amount of television in which to build a mystery box this dense. And most of the time, the show is so well constructed that the seams do not show. When the seams do show, they show in a specific way, and that is what we are here for. The plot holes in Gravity Falls are not the lazy kind, the kind you get in a show that does not care. They are almost all the result of a show that cared too much, that built more lore than it had time to tell, that decided to end early on purpose, that promised an answer in one episode and then quietly walked past it in the next. The contradictions in the canon are mostly the bruises left by a show that was trying to do something very ambitious in not very much room. They are interesting precisely because of that. We are going to start in the basement, because almost every other plot hole in the show eventually leads back there. The portal under the Mystery Shack is the engine of the entire story. The thing Stan Pines spends 3 decades trying to repair in secret. The thing that sucked his brother Stanford into another dimension in the first place. And the thing that briefly turns the world inside out in the Season 2 episode, Not What He Seems. The portal is established as a quantum destabilizer of some kind, a doorway between universes, and the show is fairly disciplined about its rules whenever Ford talks about it directly. Ford treats it as a wound in reality, something that bleeds weirdness into the surrounding area, something that should never be reopened. He treats it with the seriousness of a physicist talking about a thing he very much regrets building. And then the show, when it needs to, treats it as a kind of magical convenience, a thing whose rules tighten and loosen depending on what the plot needs in that scene. Consider what we are told about the portal's first activation. Ford and his old college partner Fiddleford McGucket build the machine together in the 80s, somewhere in the basement of what will later become the Mystery Shack. McGucket is the first one to test it, the first one to look through the door, and he is so traumatized by what he sees on the other side that he spends much of the rest of his life trying to scrub the memory of it, eventually founding the Society of the Blind Eye to forget the rest. The portal then goes through a series of accidents and shutdowns and partial activations, until Ford himself is pulled through it and is gone for 30 years. So far, so consistent. The first real problem arrives when you start to think about how Stan repairs the thing. Stan Pines, by his own admission, is not a scientist. He spent the years leading up to his arrival in Gravity Falls running cons and getting kicked out of states and selling things that did not work to people who did not want them. He is not a physicist, he is not an engineer, and he tells us, in the moments right before he reactivates the portal, that he has been studying the journals for 3 decades and barely understands a single line of them. The journals themselves are written in a code, a mixture of English, invisible ink, a personal shorthand, and Ford's own anxious handwriting that gets less and less readable as he gets closer to the end. And yet Stan, who cannot pronounce most of the words in there, somehow rebuilds an interdimensional portal from scratch, sources whatever exotic components it needs, keeps it powered, keeps the entire infrastructure of a small wooden tourist trap from collapsing under it, and successfully fires the thing without setting fire to the entire town. The show wants you to read this as the work of a man who loves his brother more than he loves his own pride. The argument it is making, and it is a beautiful one, is that 3 decades of sheer stubbornness can substitute for a doctorate. But if you press on it for even a second as a piece of mechanical reality, it does not quite hold. Stan is fixing a machine that the world's most paranoid genius built and could barely control, and he is doing it with high school physics and a soldering iron. The show knows this, which is why it never lingers on the actual repair work. We see montages, we see Stan looking tired, we see books open. We never see the moment where a man with a 6th grade understanding of electronics figures out how to align a quantum gateway. A second portal problem hides just behind that one, and it is the question of why the thing works at all without Ford. The journals describe the portal as a deeply personalized machine, calibrated by Ford, set up to obey Ford's specific designs, with safety locks and codes and contingencies that should make it almost impossible for anybody else to operate. Stan finds a workaround by physically obtaining all 3 journals, which together contain the full schematics. Fine, but once activated, the portal does exactly what Ford originally intended it to do. It opens a door, it pulls Ford back across, and it deposits him safely in the basement. The portal does not collapse. The portal does not malfunction. The portal does not do something hideous and unexpected, which the entire previous 30 years had been spent warning us it would. The show wants the moment to land emotionally, the way it does, and it absolutely does. But the careful viewer notices that the device the show has been calling apocalyptic for 2 whole seasons turns out, in the moment it matters, to be quite well behaved. It opens the door it was supposed to open, it lets the brother through, and then it dies on cue. Reality wobbles a little, the gravity in town goes sideways for a couple of minutes, and that is essentially the entire price of it. A third portal problem is one that the show actively highlights and then sets aside. Ford explains after he comes back that the portal does not just open a door, it opens a tear in the fabric of reality through which something much bigger than Ford himself could come through, and that something is Bill Cipher, who has been trying to get into the 3rd dimension for centuries. By rebuilding the portal, Stan does not just rescue his brother, he effectively rings the dinner bell. Bill has been waiting for any sufficiently large weakness in the dimensional barrier, and the moment that barrier tears wide enough, he comes through. So in the strictest sense, every event of Weirdmageddon, the catastrophic end of summer, the kidnappings and the petrifications, and the deaths that the show is too gentle to call deaths, is the direct, downstream consequence of Stan turning that portal back on. The show acknowledges this. Ford even shouts at Stan about it, briefly, in the moments after he steps through, and then, very politely, the thread is dropped. Bill does not come through immediately. Bill takes months of summer to set up his entry, manipulating Gideon, manipulating Ford himself, building the rift, hiding it inside a snow globe. Why the delay? The portal, if it is the door Ford fears it is, should have been Bill's express elevator. Instead, Bill seems to need to do the whole thing by hand, slowly, over the course of an entire season, before Weirdmageddon can begin. The show needs the delay, for storytelling reasons, of course. We need time to live with Ford back in the family, time to set up Mabel's birthday, time for Dipper to be tempted by Ford's offer to stay. But mechanically the delay is unexplained. The portal opens, the doorway exists, the wall is breached, and Bill, the entity that has been waiting for exactly that wall to break, still has to do hours of paperwork before he can use it. A fourth portal problem is the rift itself, the small glowing crack in reality that the portal leaves behind when it shuts down. The rift is the thing Ford spends the back half of Season 2 trying to contain, the thing he stores in a snow globe, the thing Mabel inadvertently hands to Blandon in disguise during her birthday party. The rift is, in essence, a Chekhov's gun the show points at the audience for several episodes. What we are not told, and what the show seems careful never to explain, is why the rift exists at all. The portal in the basement opens, pulls Ford through, and closes. The dimensional door slams shut. The whole point of the closing is that the danger is over, and yet a small, persistent, free-floating tear remains, hovering near the ceiling of the basement, glowing softly, waiting to be smashed. The show treats this as if it is obvious, as if any sufficiently big door, when slammed, leaves a crack in the wall. But Ford has never mentioned this in any of his journals. McGucket, who saw the original test fire and was traumatized by it, never mentions a rift. No previous activation of the portal has left a rift behind that the show ever bothers to depict. The rift exists essentially because the plot needs an object Bill can use. It is a beautiful piece of writing. It is also, structurally, a hole that the show does not bother to patch. The last portal problem is the smallest and the strangest. When Stan reactivates the portal, the device requires 3 special keys, 3 physical objects shaped like the symbols on the cover of each journal. He spends a substantial chunk of Season 2 acquiring those keys. But the second the portal is finished doing its job, the keys cease to matter. Nobody mentions them again. Nobody collects them. Nobody worries that some other interested party might walk into the basement, slot the keys back in, and reopen the portal. We never see the keys destroyed, never see them safely buried, never see Ford do anything with them. They were the entire mechanism of the season's second-half mystery. The things Dipper and Mabel chased, the things Gideon coveted, and the show simply forgets about them once the portal has done what it needed to do. This is a small thing, and you have to be looking for it. But it is the kind of small thing the show does over and over. A plot device matters intensely until the moment it stops mattering, and then it is allowed to disappear. From the basement we go upstairs, because the next great pile of contradictions in Gravity Falls is the question of who exactly Stan Pines has been pretending to be, and how he has been getting away with it for 30 years. The reveal at the end of the second season is that the man we have been calling Grunkle Stan is actually Stanley Pines, the twin brother of the real Stanford Pines, and that the real Stanford was the original owner of the house, the original local recluse, the original author of the journals, the person whose name is on the title of the building. Stanley has, after his brother disappeared through the portal, quietly and illegally taken his brother's identity. He has called the house his own, opened a tourist trap inside it, gone by his brother's name in all official capacities, paid his brother's taxes under his brother's name, voted as his brother, signed leases as his brother, accepted mail addressed to his brother, and let the entire town call him Mr. Pines for 3 decades, without ever quite specifying which Mr. Pines he is. The show, when it sets this up, treats it as an elegant magic trick. The audience has been calling him Grunkle Stan from the first episode, the kids have been calling him Grunkle Stan, the townspeople have been calling him Mr. Pines, and at no point have we been told what the S on his fez actually stands for. The reveal works, but the world that supports the reveal does not really hold up to inspection, and that is the next plot hole. Consider the basic legal mechanics of what Stanley has done. The real Stanford Pines was a credentialed graduate of a real university, a published author of academic papers about the paranormal, a person with a documented life and a paper trail, and presumably a social security number and a driver's license and a passport and a published bibliography. He had an address, he had a mortgage, he had utility accounts. The town of Gravity Falls knows him at least well enough that his death, if reported, would matter. When Stanley assumes his identity, he does not simply walk into a house. He has to become his brother in every administrative sense, well enough to fool the bank, well enough to fool the state of Oregon, well enough to keep the property out of probate, well enough to register a business under that name, well enough to handle the eventual inheritance question if either of their parents were still alive. The show implies that he does all this with forged paperwork, a fake death certificate filed for the original Stanley Pines, and a great deal of confidence. Even granting that Stan is a career con man, the sustained legal performance of being his twin brother for 3 decades is the kind of thing that real life punishes harshly. He would have to fake his own death to get rid of Stanley, fake his own life to inhabit Stanford, and then maintain that double fiction across every bureaucratic surface a small-town life rubs against. The show does not really want you to think about this, but if you do, the sheer volume of paperwork involved becomes faintly absurd. The townspeople are their own difficulty. We meet a number of people in Gravity Falls who clearly knew the original Stanford. Old Man McGucket, formerly Fiddleford, helped build the portal in this very basement and was Ford's research partner. Sheriff Blubbs and Deputy Durland have been in town long enough to remember the original arrival of the Pines brother. Pacifica's family, the Northwests, have founding family knowledge that goes back generations. The school, Greasy's diner, the local newspaper, the bank, all of these places have institutional memory. Stanford Pines, the genuine one, was a published parapsychologist who moved into town and built a strange wooden cabin and was visibly weird for years before he ever vanished. People knew him. People had opinions about him. And then, the show wants us to believe, his twin brother simply shows up one day, slightly different in appearance and accent and personality, and the town shrugs and accepts that this is the same guy. McGucket, in particular, is a sharp question mark here. He had worked with the original Ford. He had spent late nights in that basement. He had fought with him, suffered with him, helped him try to fix the portal. If anyone in town should have noticed the substitution, it is the man who lost his mind, partly because of how close he was to the original Ford. And yet McGucket spends most of the show treating Grunkle Stan as a stranger he occasionally bothers for parts. The in-show explanation is that McGucket has erased so many of his own memories with the Society of the Blind Eye Gun that he has lost most of his recognition of his old friend, which is plausible, but it is plausible because the show is leaning on his memory loss to paper over what is structurally a very strange coincidence. The bigger inconsistency in the Stanley and Stanford ruse is the question of his hand. The real Stanford Pines has 6 fingers on each hand. This is a defining physical feature of his entire life, the thing other children mocked him for, the thing that gave him the nickname Sixer, the thing that ends up on the cover of every one of his journals. Stanley has the standard 5 fingers per hand. In a small town where the original Stanford was already considered odd, the disappearance of his most distinctive feature should have been the first thing somebody noticed. Stan would have had to either keep his hands hidden in gloves for 3 decades, which he very visibly does not, or rely on the fact that nobody in Gravity Falls had ever made eye contact with Stanford's actual hands during the time he lived there, before being pulled through the portal. The show, for plot reasons, simply does not address this. We see Stan with his bare hands constantly. He uses them to take tickets, to count money, to drive, to swing crowbars at supernatural creatures. The town watches him do all of this. Nobody ever says, "Did you not used to have 6 fingers?" The in-show explanation, if we are being generous, is that Ford was so reclusive that almost nobody in town ever actually saw his hands clearly enough to register the difference, and that the townspeople are not, on the whole, the most observant. That is the explanation the show is implicitly offering. It is also a very thin one. A quieter wrinkle to the identity question, and one that is even less commented on, is the voice. Stanley, in the flashback episodes, has a noticeably different speaking voice from his brother. He has a different posture, a different way of moving, a different style of dress, a different way of carrying himself in a room. Ford is buttoned up, intellectual, formal, slightly tense. Stan is loose, loud, theatrical. The show wants you to read these as 2 very different people, whose differences make the identity swap a heroic act of impersonation. But impersonation that works on a stranger for 10 minutes does not necessarily work on a town for 3 decades. People who knew the original Stanford would have had to slowly accept that he had become a louder, slightly less educated, slightly more theatrical version of himself, with completely different mannerisms, the day he came back from his trip. They accept it because the plot needs them to. It is, again, the kind of thing the show is asking you not to look at too closely. Then the question of money. The Mystery Shack, as a business, is a thriving tourist trap. It clearly takes in a substantial cash flow, enough to keep Stan in a comfortable, if unglamorous lifestyle, to pay Wendy and Seuss, to support Dipper and Mabel for an entire summer, and to fund Stan's continuing secret repair of the portal in the basement. The portal repair, on its own, must have cost a small fortune, the kind of money you cannot easily explain on a tourist trap's tax return. Where exactly is the money for that coming from? The show implies that Stan has been quietly running side businesses, possibly some of them not strictly legal, but it never gets specific. The journals indicate that Ford had federal funding, university grants, and possibly classified contracts during his original research. Stan has none of those. He has fez sales and bobblehead sales and the occasional photograph with a stuffed jackalope. That money does not, by any reasonable accounting, fund a quantum destabilizer. The show waves at this by having Stan be a con man, and we are meant to assume he is using cons to bridge the gap. But the specific arithmetic of how a small souvenir shop pays for 30 years of bleeding-edge physics is one of those things the show simply chooses not to itemize. The question of who knew is another door the show shuts quickly. The implication is that exactly nobody in the world knew Stan's secret. Not the kids, not Wendy, not Seuss, not the townspeople, not even the federal agents who occasionally turn up in suits to investigate Gravity Falls. And yet the federal agents, in particular, are a problem. Agent Powers and Agent Trigger arrive in town in the back half of the show, specifically because the federal government has been tracking unusual energy signatures coming from the Mystery Shack for years. They have file folders, they have surveillance equipment, they have a budget, and in all that time, with all that intelligence apparatus pointed at one specific wooden cabin, none of them have ever cross-referenced the man living in that cabin against the documented existence of Stanley Pines. The original Stanley would have had a criminal record. He would have outstanding warrants. He would be a known quantity in at least a few state databases. Any reasonably thorough federal investigation of a suspicious property in Oregon would, by hour 1, have established that the man inside it is not actually the man on the deed. The show simply does not allow them to do that. The agents bumble, the agents miss things. The agents are written, with great affection, as not very good at their jobs, which is convenient for everyone involved. The children themselves close out the identity question. Dipper and Mabel arrive in Gravity Falls knowing that Grunkle Stan is their great-uncle on their mother's side. They have presumably grown up hearing about him, looking at family photos, hearing family stories. The Pines family, on screen at least, includes a brother who became a parapsychologist and disappeared. If the family has any kind of memory at all, the disappearance of the original Stanford Pines should be a story the children have heard. The fact that Grunkle Stan, who is supposedly their mother's uncle, never quite matches the descriptions in those stories, should have caused at least one cousin or aunt to mention something at some point in 12 years. The show handles this by having the family essentially abandon the Stanley line entirely, treating Stanley as estranged, treating Ford as the lost one, and treating the kids as too young to have ever asked about either of them. It is plausible. It is also, like everything else in this section, a very thin wall holding up a very heavy plot. If the portal is the engine of the show, the three journals are the map, and the journals are their own dense little knot of contradictions. Ford writes 3 of them across his time in Gravity Falls, numbered 1 and 2 and 3, each one bound in identical leather, each one stamped with a gold hand bearing 6 fingers and a single numeral on the palm. The journals are presented as the comprehensive notebooks of a brilliant researcher slowly losing his grip on reality, and they are gorgeous as objects. They are also, when you start to lay them out on a timeline, slightly impossible. The first contradiction is the question of where the journals were during the 30 years Ford was missing. The show eventually tells us that Ford, sensing he was being hunted, hid the journals in different locations around town so that no single person could ever possess all 3 at once. Journal 3 is the one Dipper finds buried in the woods near the beginning of the show, dug up in a kind of hidden compartment, ready to be discovered. Journal 2 surfaces in Gideon Gleeful's possession, having been found, the show implies, by Gideon's family sometime before. Journal 1 is in Stan's hands, having been kept by him from the moment his brother vanished. Lay those 3 locations against each other, and a small problem appears. Ford, the show tells us, hid the journals himself before being pulled through the portal. He hid them carefully, in separate places, in such a way that nobody would find them by accident. But Stan has Journal 1 from day one. The implication is that Stan was given Journal 1 directly by Ford in the moments before the accident, the only one of the 3 not hidden out in the world. Yet Ford, in his flashbacks, treats Stan as the last person on Earth he would trust with the journals. The 2 had been estranged for years. The brothers fight viciously in the basement immediately before the accident, in a confrontation that ends with Ford being knocked into the portal beam. So why does Stan have Journal 1? The show implies, in fragmentary flashbacks, that Ford gave it to him in the final moments before the fight escalated, asking Stan to take it as far from Gravity Falls as possible and never let anyone find it. Stan, having vowed to bring his brother back, then kept the journal as the only key he had. Fine. But that gives Stan exactly the wrong journal for the work he is trying to do. The schematics for the portal, the show later confirms, are split across the 3 journals, with the most crucial diagrams in Journal 3. So Stan begins his 3-decade repair project with the one journal that contains the least useful information about the machine he is trying to fix. He has to spend most of the show acquiring the other 2, decades later, before he can finish the work. The show treats this as part of the suspense. It is also a slightly absurd inheritance, given the stakes. A second journal problem is the inconsistency of the invisible ink. The show makes a great deal, in early episodes, of the fact that the journals contain hidden writing, revealed only by black light or by specific chemical reactions. Dipper spends entire episodes uncovering invisible passages, peeling back layers of text, finding revelations stashed between the lines. The invisible ink, the show implies, was Ford's last layer of paranoia, his way of hiding the most dangerous information even from somebody who held the book in their hands. By the second half of the show, the invisible ink has essentially disappeared as a plot device. New revelations come from new pages, from new chapters, from new sections that were always visible. The amount of hidden ink the journals contain seems to scale roughly with how much new information the writers wanted to reveal that week. It is the kind of thing that, individually, is not really a problem, but over the run of a series it adds up. The journals seem to expand, page-wise and content-wise, as the plot needs them to. There is no canonical count of how many pages each journal contains. There is no clean accounting of which secrets are written in regular ink and which are written in invisible ink. The journals function, structurally, as a magic notebook whose contents grow as the audience requires them to grow. A third problem with the journals is the question of Ford's handwriting and what it implies about his timeline. The journals are written in a steadily deteriorating hand, with sentences growing more frantic, lines tilting more steeply, words becoming more crowded as the books progress. The show wants you to read this as a man losing his composure under Bill's growing influence, a sane scientist gradually unraveling. The trouble is that the journals cover a relatively short period of Ford's pre-portal life, and the deterioration is depicted as quite rapid. By the end of Journal 3, Ford is essentially raving on the page, telling future readers to trust no one. He then goes through the portal and is gone for 30 years. When he comes back, he is composed, articulate, dressed for combat, capable of explaining complex topics with academic precision. The man whose handwriting fell apart in the back pages of the third journal is now the most put-together character in the show. The implication is that the 30 years in the multiverse healed him in some way, gave him resolve, hardened him into the version we meet. That works as character writing. It does not really work as continuity. The Ford we meet at the end of Season 2 has none of the manic terror of the Ford whose words close out Journal 3. The show smooths this over by simply not addressing it. The journals are the work of a man on the edge. The man we meet has stepped back from the edge and never explains how. There is also the question of how Ford had time to write the journals at all. The show implies that Ford and McGucket were building the portal in parallel with Ford writing his observations down, and that Ford spent his early years in Gravity Falls cataloging every supernatural creature in the surrounding forest. He documents gnomes, manitars, lake monsters, fairies, an extensive bestiary of weirdness, with diagrams and field notes and quoted dialogue from creatures he interviewed. The volume of work in even a single journal is enormous. To produce 3 of them at this level of detail, complete with experimental observations, sketches, schematics, and self-analysis, would have taken years of full-time fieldwork. And yet Ford is, during this same period, supposedly building the portal, dealing with his deteriorating relationship with McGucket, being courted by Bill, conducting government correspondence, and slowly losing his sanity. There simply are not enough hours in those years for him to have done all the things the journals depict him doing. The show, again, does not invite the question. It hands you the 3 journals as completed objects, lets you marvel at them, and trusts you not to ask when the man slept. One more inconsistency lives in this part of the show. Smaller, but interesting. Ford insists, repeatedly, that the journals are the only complete record of his research. He treats them as singular objects whose loss would be catastrophic. The journals contain, he says, everything we know about Gravity Falls. And yet in later episodes we see Ford keeping additional notebooks, additional folders, additional papers, additional research that exists outside the 3 numbered books. He has files in cabinets, he has documents in drawers, he has at one point a separate research notebook he carries around. The 3 journals, in other words, are not actually the complete record of his work. They are the public set, the ones designed to be passed on. Whatever Ford was doing on the side, whatever the side notebooks contain, is never quite catalogued or shown. The journals are, narratively, the spine of the show. They are not, literally, the only book on the shelf. Whether that is a contradiction or simply an artifact of a show that ran out of time to formalize its own canon is open to interpretation. It is a small, loose thread, the kind that becomes meaningful only if you tug on it. The last journal problem is the smallest and the most charming. Ford writes the journals partly in a personal shorthand he invented, partly in plain English, and partly in 3 encryption schemes that fans have spent the last decade decoding. The codes include a Caesar cipher, a substitution method called @bash, and a number-based scheme called A1Z26, all of which the show winks at in its credit sequences. The trouble is that Ford, when speaking to characters in the show, claims to have used these codes specifically to keep the journals safe from prying eyes. And yet the codes themselves are some of the easiest classical ciphers in the world, the kind of thing a curious teenager could solve in an afternoon. They are decorative ciphers, intended for puzzle hunters in the audience, not real security. The in-show Ford, who fears Bill so much that he hides 3 books in 3 corners of town, would presumably have used something stronger than a code that any local kid could break with a pencil and a notebook. The show, again, is not interested in answering this. The codes are for us. The in-show fiction is that they are for safety. The two purposes do not quite line up. After the journals, the next great fault line in the show is the figure who haunts them, the triangular yellow demon at the center of the entire mystery. Bill Cipher is the show's main villain, a dream demon, a creature of pure mind who exists outside the normal flow of time and space. He is also, structurally, the show's biggest single source of plot holes, because the rules governing what he can and cannot do shift constantly across the run, expanding when the show needs him to be terrifying, and contracting when the show needs the heroes to actually be able to fight back. Start with the question of what Bill is and where he comes from. The show, in its main run, gives you a sketch. Bill is from the second dimension. Bill destroyed his home dimension. Bill has been trying to get into the third dimension for a very long time. Bill makes deals. Bill can possess people, but only if they invite him in. Bill can enter dreams. Bill is, in some sense, a being of pure thought, with no permanent physical form, who appears only in visions, hallucinations, and the dreams of sleeping humans. Those are the rules as we get them. Almost every one of them breaks at some point in the show. The dream rule is the first to crack. Bill, when we meet him in the Season 1 episode Dreamscaperers, can only enter the mental space of sleeping humans. He has to ride into the mind of a sleeper through a specific ritual, and he is trapped there until the sleeper wakes. This is a fairly clean piece of horror writing, the kind that gives the show some lovely surreal imagery and a strong first introduction to the villain. By later seasons, Bill is no longer confined to dreams. He can appear in mirrors. He can manifest in the waking world as a flickering hallucination. He can speak to characters who are visibly conscious, standing in normal daylight with no ritual in progress. The show implies that his power grows over the course of the series, which is fine in itself. But the rules he supposedly cannot break get broken with no acknowledgement. The original limitation was a hard, mystical boundary, the kind of thing that defined what Bill was. By the end of Season 2, that boundary is barely visible. The possession rule has the same problem. Bill, in his early appearances, is presented as a creature who can only inhabit a body if the body's owner consents. This is the entire mechanism of his most famous scheme in the show, the deal he makes with Dipper in the second season episode Sock Opera, where Dipper agrees to let Bill possess him in exchange for help. The deal is the door. Without the deal, Bill cannot get in. The show frames this as one of the most important rules in his game. By Weirdmageddon, Bill is happily possessing whoever he likes, including Ford, including hostages, including beings he has just met. The consent rule, when the plot requires drama, is conveniently set aside. The show implies, in some fragments, that the rules apply only to certain kinds of possession, or only to possessions that last beyond a certain length of time, or only to possessions performed under certain conditions. But it never quite says this out loud. The audience is left to assume that Bill's powers have grown enough that the old rules no longer constrain him, which is a reasonable assumption that the show simply asks you to make on your own. The question of the unicorn hair sits next to all this. The show establishes, late in Season 2, that a circle of unicorn hair can keep Bill out of a physical space. Ford, having spent decades fighting Bill, has surrounded his mind with a metal plate of similar protective material, which prevents Bill from reading his thoughts or possessing him. The unicorn hair is treated as a real defense, the kind of thing that can keep the Mystery Shack itself safe from Bill's reach during Weirdmageddon. The plot hole here is small and obvious. If unicorn hair is enough to repel a creature of Bill's power, why did Ford not surround the entire portal with unicorn hair the moment he discovered Bill was trying to use it? Why did Ford not build the basement out of unicorn hair-plated walls? Why did the protection have to wait until the kids essentially harvested it themselves, in panic, during the run-up to the climax? The answer, almost certainly, is that Ford did not know about the unicorn hair until later, or that he could not get it in sufficient quantity, or that the unicorns themselves are uncooperative. The show never quite explains. It produces the protection when the story needs it, in roughly the quantity the story needs, and lets you fill in the rest. The unicorn hair is a magical safety net the show keeps in its back pocket and produces on demand. Then comes the question of how Bill is finally defeated, and why his defeat is structured the way it is. In the finale, Stan and Ford allow Bill to enter Stan's mind, and Ford then erases Stan's memory using the same memory gun that the Society of the Blind Eye used decades earlier. Bill, trapped inside Stan's mind at the moment the memory is erased with it. This is a clean, beautiful, devastating ending for the character, and it asks Stan to give up his entire identity to save the world. It also raises questions. Bill is described as a being of pure thought, a creature that exists across dimensions, a being who could survive the death of his home universe. How does the localized erasure of one human's memory destroy something that vast? The show's implicit answer is that Bill, having entered the physical world, was now bound by the rules of that world, including the rule that a mind is the only place a mind can live. If Stan's mind is erased while Bill is inside it, Bill goes with it. This is poetic, and it works as an ending, but it is a rule the show has never previously stated. It is invented in the moment, to give the heroes a way to win. The audience accepts it, because the moment is so emotionally charged that you do not stop to ask. But the rule is genuinely new on the screen at the moment of its use. The other Bill problem is the question of his deals, and what they actually bind. Bill makes deals with multiple characters across the run. He makes a deal with Ford in the 80s to help inspire the portal. He makes deals with Gideon. He makes a deal with Dipper. He makes a deal with Stan in the finale. He even, by most accounts, tricks Mabel into giving up the rift through a disguised intermediary at her birthday party, though that one looks more like a con than a formal bargain. He makes deals with assorted other characters in the multiverse. The deals are presented as binding, the kind of thing that, once shaken on, cannot be undone. And yet none of the deals actually constrain him for very long. He breaks the spirit of every deal he makes. He twists the language of every deal he honors. He treats the deals as opening moves rather than as actual contracts. The show wants you to feel that the deals matter, that signing one is a dangerous and irreversible act. The actual mechanical consequences of the deals, however, are usually quite light. Bill helps, then he betrays, then he moves on. The deals are dramatic flourishes, more than they are real constraints. Closing out his rules is the question of why Bill needs the rift at all. The show tells us that Bill has been trying to enter the third dimension for centuries. The show tells us that he has been blocked by some kind of dimensional barrier. The show tells us that he can enter dreams and minds and visions, but cannot manifest physically in the waking world without help. So far, fine. But the show also tells us that Bill has been making physical interventions in the waking world for years. He has guided Ford in his lab. He has, at various points, possessed bodies, moved objects, manipulated technology. If he can do all of those things, the dimensional barrier he supposedly cannot cross seems quite porous. The show's implicit answer is that those were all small interventions, possible only through hosts, possible only in fragments, and that a full manifestation requires the rift. That is consistent, but it requires you to read several different kinds of intervention as fundamentally different in scale, which the show never explicitly does. Bill's powers, in practice, are whatever the scene requires. The barrier blocking him is whatever the scene requires. The audience pieces the rest together. There is a deeper inconsistency in Bill's whole concept, and it is one that the show eventually addresses, but only in supplementary material outside the main run. Bill is described as a being from the second dimension who could only perceive flatness, who broke into the third dimension and could suddenly see in new directions, who experiences time non-linearly and can therefore plan thousands of years ahead. Take those properties seriously, and Bill should be a much more powerful villain than the show ever quite allows. A being who sees time non-linearly does not get outmaneuvered by 12-year-olds. A being who can plan thousands of years ahead does not get fooled by a fake portrait of his enemy. A being who knows the future as well as the past does not need to make deals at all, because he already knows the outcome. The show wants Bill to be cosmically terrifying and also dramatically beatable. Those two properties pull in opposite directions. The plot holes around Bill's intelligence and foresight are, in essence, the cost of giving the heroes a chance. Bill has to be smart enough to be scary and dumb enough to lose. The show splits the difference by making him erratic, theatrical, impulsive, and easily distracted by a good joke. It mostly works. But you have to be willing to accept that the smartest character in the multiverse is also the one most likely to be hoodwinked by a sock puppet. The next great cluster of plot holes lives inside the Society of the Blind Eye, the underground organization that exists in Gravity Falls for the sole purpose of erasing memories. The society is introduced as an old secret group dedicated to keeping the supernatural side of the town hidden, primarily by hunting down anyone who has seen too much and zapping the relevant memories out of their head with a custom-built memory gun. The society is run, by the time we meet it, by a man in a hood who turns out to be Ivan, a forgettable middle-aged townsperson. The original founder, we eventually learn, was Fiddleford McGucket himself, who built the gun in the 80s to erase his own memory of the portal and then accidentally turned it into the foundation of a memory cult. The first inconsistency is the question of how widely the memory gun has been used. The Society, in the present day of the show, has erased the memories of essentially every townsperson who has ever stumbled onto a supernatural event. We see them, in their underground headquarters, with shelves full of memory tubes, each tube labeled with a name and a topic. The shelves are stacked thousands deep. The implication is that almost every adult in Gravity Falls has had their memory tampered with at least once. This explains, neatly, why the townspeople do not panic about the constant low-level weirdness of their own town. They have all been zapped. They forget the gnomes by lunchtime. They forget the lake monster by dinner. They go to bed every night with the version of Gravity Falls that the Society has decided they are allowed to remember. As an explanation, this is elegant. As a system, it makes almost no operational sense. Consider the staffing. The Society we meet, when Dipper and Mabel finally infiltrate it, consists of a handful of men in hooded robes, maybe a dozen members at most. A dozen people, working part-time, cannot possibly keep up with the volume of memory erasing that the town would actually require. The town, by all evidence, has supernatural incidents on what looks like a weekly basis. Gnomes assault tourists. A lake monster surfaces. Wax figures come alive and commit attempted murder. Pterodactyls fly out of a sealed cavern. Time travelers wander in and out. Each one of those incidents produces witnesses, victims, families of victims, people who have to be tracked, located, restrained, and zapped before they tell anyone else. A dozen part-time cultists cannot possibly handle that workload. The show, however, treats the Society as if it can. The shelves of memory tubes imply that they have processed thousands of people. The size of the active membership implies that they have processed at most a few hundred. The numbers, when you start adding them up, do not work. The technology itself is the next puzzle. The memory gun is built by McGucket using parts he scrounged together in the 80s. A piece of handmade equipment that should, by every law of electronics, have stopped working decades ago. Memory tubes, in turn, are presented as glass vessels filled with glowing mist, each one a specific memory pulled out of a specific person. There is no clear technical explanation for how the gun extracts the memory, how it stores it, how it later restores it to a different person, or how the tubes maintain their contents over time. The show treats the gun as essentially magical. The trouble is that the gun is also presented as a piece of replicable, repairable, modifiable technology, the kind of thing that other characters can pick up and use. Mabel, at one point, uses it to threaten her own family. Stan, at one point, uses it on Bill. The Society uses it on civilians. Ford eventually uses it on Stan. The gun moves from hand to hand with no calibration, no special operator, no specialized training. It seems to work for whoever points it. That is the kind of technology that, in a world of memory cults and federal agents and corrupt small-town politics, should have proliferated quickly. The show acts as if the gun is unique. There is no clear and show reason it should be. Then comes the deeper question, the one that breaks the Society's entire premise. The Society's whole purpose, the cult's reason for existing, is to keep the town free of supernatural knowledge. But the supernatural knowledge of the town is sitting, in plain English, in 3 journals that Ford wrote and hid in 3 different places. The journals are the most comprehensive record of every weird thing that has ever happened in the woods. They contain diagrams, names, descriptions, weaknesses, the entire bestiary. If the Society's job is to suppress the truth, they should be obsessed with finding and destroying the journals. They should have spent decades hunting them. They should have memory zapped anyone who had ever touched them. And yet, in the entire course of the show, the Society shows no awareness of the journal's existence. They never go after the journals. They never search for them. They have apparently spent 30 years erasing the memories of bystanders while leaving the actual encyclopedia of town weirdness sitting in a shallow grave in the forest. The plot device of the Society and the plot device of the journals do not really know about each other. They were probably written in different rooms. The Society also presents a continuity question about McGucket himself. McGucket, the founder of the Society, has used his own memory gun on himself dozens of times across the years to erase his own most painful memories. He is, when we meet him, essentially a husk of his former self, a brilliant scientist reduced to mumbling on the side of the road. The cure, in the show, is for the kids to undo all of his self-erasures at once by restoring his memories from the tubes the society has kept. After this restoration, McGucket comes back to himself almost instantly. He stands up straight, speaks clearly, regains his old expertise, and within an episode or two is functioning as a brilliant engineer again. The implicit suggestion is that memory restoration is a clean process, that pouring decades of erased memory back into a man's head produces a coherent return of the man. Real psychology does not work this way. Real trauma does not unspool that neatly. But the larger inconsistency is that the memory tubes, which contain decades of specific memories, are themselves not really shown to be enough to reconstruct a personality. McGucket's transformation is faster and more complete than any reasonable reading of the technology should allow. The show wants him cured by the end of that storyline, so he is cured by the end of that storyline. The plot moves on. The society also has a strange relationship with the federal agents who arrive in town in the back half of the show. Powers and Trigger are investigating Gravity Falls because the federal government has noticed strange energy patterns coming from the town. The society's entire purpose, again, is to keep these things hidden. If they are competent at their job, the moment two federal agents arrive in town to investigate the weirdness, the society should be all over them. Memory tubes should appear. The agents should leave with no memory of why they came, and yet the society shows no interest in the agents whatsoever. They do not appear in any of the storylines involving Powers and Trigger. They do not protect the town from federal scrutiny. They are entirely absent from the moment outside attention arrives. The society is depicted as obsessive in the storyline that introduces it, and then essentially vanishes from the show, leaving the town's secret-keeping to chance. The convenient reading is that the society was disbanded by the kids after their infiltration. That works for the storyline that introduced them. It does not work for the world the show then continues to depict, in which the supernatural side of Gravity Falls continues to be, somehow, secret. One more memory plot hole is worth pulling on, and it concerns the finale itself. Ford uses the memory gun on Stan in the climactic scene, erasing his brother's entire identity in order to destroy Bill Cipher, who is trapped inside Stan's mind. Stan, in the closing moments of the finale, is essentially a blank, with no memory of who he is, who his family is, what he has just done, or what his life has been. Mabel then brings him back by reminding him of his bond with the children, by showing him photos, by talking him through his past. He returns to himself by the end of the episode. This is gorgeous and devastating, and works on a pure emotional level. It is also, mechanically, completely at odds with how the memory gun has been depicted throughout the rest of the show. Earlier in the show, the memory gun has been shown to be precise but irreversible without the matching memory tubes. Once a memory is gone, you cannot get it back without the stored copy. The whole reason McGucket needed the kids to restore him was that the tubes existed. Stan, in the finale, has no tubes. Mabel has no recording of his memories to pour back in. She is reawakening them through emotional appeal alone. Either the memory gun is more reversible than the show ever previously implied, or Stan's memory loss in the finale was not as total as it seemed, or the bond he has built with his family is somehow magical in a way the rest of the show has not depicted. The show simply trusts you to feel the moment and not ask. Most viewers comply. From the society, we move to the man who founded it, and to the strange shape of his life across the show. Old Man McGucket is one of the most lovable and most contradictory characters in Gravity Falls, a figure whose backstory shifts dramatically across the run, who occupies several roles that do not really fit together, and whose recovery from decades of self-inflicted brain damage happens with a speed that the show needs but never quite earns. When we first meet McGucket, in the early episodes of Season 1, he is presented as a wandering local kook, a barefoot old man in overalls who lives on a houseboat, talks to himself, and occasionally builds robotic monsters from spare parts that then attack the town. He is, in the early run, more or less a comic relief character, the kind of harmless lunatic who exists in the background of every animated town. The show wants you to laugh at him. We laugh at him. He has no consistent backstory at this point, no clear past, no relationships to the other characters in the show. He is local color. He is part of the texture of Gravity Falls. By the second season, McGucket is suddenly revealed to be the former research partner of Stanford Pines, a graduate of a prestigious technical school, a brilliant engineer who helped build the portal, and the founder of the Society of the Blind Eye. The shift is enormous. The man who in early episodes was a barefoot junkyard inventor is, in retrospect, one of the most accomplished minds in the entire town. The person who designed the memory gun, the person who tested the portal first, the person whose decline is the most tragic single story in the show. When the show pulls this reveal, it treats it as if it had been telegraphed all along. There are hints in early episodes if you look closely. McGucket's tinkering, his engineering ability, his presence at key locations. But the early characterization does not really set up the late reveal. The early McGucket and the late McGucket are essentially two different characters. The show stitches them together by saying that the memory gun is responsible for the deterioration, that the early McGucket is a brain-damaged version of the late McGucket, that the contradictions in his behavior are themselves evidence of how much damage he has done to himself. That stitch works, for the most part, but it does not really account for the specifics. The early McGucket, in his first season appearances, talks in nonsense word salad. He claims, repeatedly, to have eaten government cheese and to have once kissed an alligator. He invents on the fly. He behaves like a man whose mind has been entirely scrambled, not just scrubbed of specific memories. The late McGucket, after his restoration, retains his engineering competence and his general intelligence. He had, by the show's own logic, only erased certain memories, specifically the traumatic ones related to the portal. The rest of his mind should have been intact all along. He should have been able to function as a competent old man with selective gaps in his history. Instead, the show wants us to believe that the memory loss was so total that he forgot how to wear shoes. Either the memory gun is more destructive than its in-show description, or McGucket's specific damage was unusual, or the show is using his early appearances as comedy and then retroactively explaining them with a mechanism that does not really fit. Most likely the third. Then there is the matter of his housing. Early McGucket lives on a houseboat. Late McGucket, after his recovery, ascends, somehow, to ownership of the Northwest Manor by the end of the show, after the Northwests are forced to give it up in the wake of Weirdmageddon. McGucket goes from a barefoot squatter on the lake to the millionaire owner of the town's grandest house in roughly a season. The show implies that he made his fortune in technology, that he had hidden patents, that he had savings he could not access until his memory returned, that his old life rebuilt itself the moment he became himself again. None of this is depicted. We do not see the patents being collected. We do not see the wealth materializing. McGucket simply becomes rich, off-screen, as a kind of fairy tale ending for a character the show had long abused. As a piece of writing, it is sweet. As a piece of continuity, it is faintly absurd. The show essentially uses his recovery as a magic spell that restores his finances, his housing, his social standing, and his cognitive function all at once. The show also implies, in fragments, that McGucket has a son who appears at the demolition derby and is generally embarrassed by his father. The son is barely characterized. He shows up, has a few lines, and disappears. We never learn his mother's name, never see McGucket's old family home, never get the story of how a young Stanford-era McGucket became a husband and a father and then lost both of them to his own decline. The implication is that his wife left him during his deterioration, that the son grew up estranged, that the relationship is broken. None of this is dramatized. The son exists primarily so that McGucket has somebody to embarrass, and then he disappears from the show. By the time McGucket is restored to himself, the son is essentially absent. We do not see them reconcile. We do not see them rebuild. The family tragedy implied by McGucket's life is sketched once and then dropped. It is the kind of half-developed thread that the show has a lot of in its margins. The original partnership with Ford has the same problem. McGucket and Ford, the show implies, worked together for years on the portal and on a host of other projects. They were close friends. They were collaborators. Their fallout, the show says, was caused by McGucket's near-death experience during the portal's first test, when he looked through it and saw something so terrible that he could never unsee it. Ford insisted on continuing the work. McGucket left. The relationship broke. This is a tidy and tragic backstory. The trouble is that the show never quite reconciles it with the Ford we eventually meet. The Ford of the present day is depicted as a man devastated by what Bill did to him, conscious of the cost of his obsession, regretful of the partners he lost. He is, by the time he returns from the portal, ready to mend bridges. And yet his reunion with McGucket, when it finally comes, is curiously muted. Ford does not seek McGucket out. Ford does not apologize. Ford does not collaborate with him on rebuilding the town's defenses against Bill, even though McGucket is the most qualified engineer in Gravity Falls. The two share a few brief scenes near the end, and the show implies that they are friendly again. But the depth of their reconciliation is never really staged. The show gives you the broken friendship in flashback, and then asks you to imagine the repair off-screen. The McGucket arc, in the end, is one of the show's most ambitious and most undercooked subplots. The character is given an enormous backstory that does not quite match the character he was in early episodes. The mechanism of his recovery is given more weight than the writing can really support. The aftermath of his recovery is given more wealth and influence than the show ever explains. And the original tragedy of his fallout with Ford is given more depth than the eventual reunion ever pays back. McGucket is, in many ways, the show's most lovable character. He is also the character whose continuity contains the most loose ends. There is enough in the margins of his story to fill another season. There just was not another season to fill. One more McGucket thread is worth pulling on, and it is the question of the robot. In the back half of Season 2, McGucket builds a giant fighting robot, called the Shacktron in the show's marketing, to fight Bill's forces during Weirdmageddon. The robot is the size of a building. It is welded together from the Mystery Shack itself, plus assorted scrap parts, plus a great deal of whatever McGucket can find in the woods. It is built in roughly one episode. It is built by an old man and a handful of children. It is built with no clear power source, no clear blueprint, no clear time frame, and it works. The robot fights, the robot punches, the robot destroys eyebats by the dozen. As a piece of triumphant visual storytelling, it is delightful. As a piece of plausible engineering, it is impossible. McGucket has, in essence, become a magical character by the end of the show, capable of building anything the plot needs in the time the plot allows. The show treats this as a function of his restored genius. It is, in fact, a function of the show needing a war machine and not having room to explain where one came from. If you sit down and try to lay the chronology of Gravity Falls out on a wall, the next plot hole you run into is the one nobody ever quite warns you about. The show's internal timeline is genuinely broken in several places, and the breaks compound. The series takes place over one summer. The summer Dipper and Mabel are 12, the summer that ends with their 13th birthday party. That structure is the show's promise to the audience. The first episode begins in roughly early June. The finale episodes take place around the end of August. That gives the show about 3 months of in-fiction time to do everything it does, and the show does a great deal. Start with the cast. Dipper and Mabel are 12. Wendy is 15, established explicitly in dialogue. Seuss is 20-something. Pacifica is 12. Gideon is roughly 9 or 10. Grunkle Stan, by the time the show begins, has been in Gravity Falls for around 3 decades. Ford, when he comes back through the portal, is the same age as Stan, having barely aged in the multiverse due to dimensional effects the show waves at but does not explain. The school, in the show's background, lets out for summer at the beginning of the series. The school resumes, presumably, by early September. Everything has to fit inside that window. Now lay the episodes against that window and see what happens. Each episode, in the show's internal logic, takes place on a single day or across a small number of days. There are 40 episodes plus shorts. Even if every episode covered a single day, that would be 40 days of summer, which fits inside roughly 6 weeks. The show, however, includes a number of plot lines that imply much more elapsed time. Dipper has a developing crush on Wendy that supposedly grows over weeks. Mabel has multiple weekly summer romances. Stan has running cons that span weeks. The portal repair takes the entire summer. Various characters take multi-day trips out of town. The Gobblewonker hunt, the haunted convenience store, the wax figure murder, the lake monster, the pterodactyl, the time travel adventures, the prison breakout, the visit to the science fair, the various dates and breakups and feuds. All of these have to fit inside roughly 3 months of clock time, and they do not really. The show implies more time than the calendar allows. The summer of Gravity Falls is, internally, longer than 3 months. You can see the squeeze most clearly in the late Season 2 storyline. Ford comes back through the portal somewhere in the middle of the back half of the season. The events between his return and Weirdmageddon, the rift, Mabel's birthday party, the look at Bill's mindscape, the various adventures Ford takes Dipper on, the slow build of tension at the shack, all of these are depicted across what feels like several weeks of in-show time. And yet, by the show's own internal markers, Ford returns in midsummer, and Weirdmageddon ignites only weeks later. With the rift breaking at Mabel's birthday party, and the twins' actual 13th birthday following soon after, at the very end of summer. The window between Ford's return and the catastrophe is short. The events stuffed into it are many. The show pushes them apart with implication and lets you smooth them together in your head. There is also the question of the school year. Gravity Falls has a high school, attended by Wendy and her friends, and a middle school, attended by Pacifica and Gideon during the school year. The school year, in the show's logic, ends in early summer and resumes after Weirdmageddon, after the kids go home. But Wendy and Robbie and the other older teenagers in the show seem to be on summer break for the duration of the series. The middle schoolers, also on break, are similarly available throughout. Yet the show shows occasional summer school activities, school-related plot lines, references to homework, references to teachers, in ways that suggest the school year is not quite as cleanly bounded as the summer setup implies. There are small contradictions in the school calendar that the show simply does not bother to resolve. School is happening or not happening depending on what each episode needs. The bigger timeline problem is the question of how long Stan has been in town. The show implies, at various points, that Stan arrived in Gravity Falls roughly 3 decades before the events of the show, that he took over the house, that he spent that long repairing the portal in secret. 3 decades, in television math, is a round number that allows for backstory. But when you start counting specific events, those decades get crowded. Stan arrives. Stan establishes his cover. Stan opens the mystery shack. The shack runs for years before Seuss is hired. Seuss works there from his teenage years. Wendy is hired at 15. McGucket has been in the woods for almost the entire period. Various tourist seasons cycle through. Various federal agents come and go. The portal repair, depicted as a constant background activity, has to be slotted between all of these. 3 decades is plenty of time for all of it, if you spread it evenly. But the show often suggests that specific events happened both decades ago and only a few years ago. The Northwests have been wealthy and corrupt for around 150 years, which is fine. The tent of telepathy has been operating, by implication, for years before Dipper and Mabel arrive, which means Gideon has been performing since he was very small. Various businesses in town have signs that imply a founding year far before the show. Other businesses imply a founding year that does not quite fit. The show is, broadly, internally consistent, but the local chronology is loose enough that fans have spent years trying to pin it down and have not really succeeded. Wendy is the next puzzle. Wendy is 15 during the show. Dipper is 12. The show treats the age gap between them as a real obstacle, the kind of thing that should make Dipper's crush essentially impossible to consummate. And the show is right to treat it that way. But the show also features romantic complications around Wendy and Robbie, who is by the show's implication around her age or slightly older, and various tensions with Tambry and the rest of the teen group. Tambry is also implied to be a teenager, of unspecified age. Lee and Nate are older. None of these specific ages are confirmed beyond Wendy's, which means the rest of the teen group exists in a vague range. That is fine in itself, but the show implies that some of them are old enough to drive, old enough to work, old enough to be at the tent of telepathy as paying customers, and at other moments implies that they are young enough to be hanging out with Wendy at 15. The teen group is essentially a grab bag of ages that the show treats as monolithic. Then there is Seuss, who is the most age-confused character in the show. Seuss is, at various points, described as in his 20s, depicted as living with his grandmother, shown as having a crush on Melody, who is roughly his peer, shown as needing parental approval for major life decisions, shown as a kid in flashbacks, shown as an adult in flashbacks, shown as having worked at the Mystery Shack for years before the show begins. His actual age is never quite given. He is, in some episodes, treated as essentially an older brother to Dipper and Mabel. In other episodes, he is treated as a peer of Stan. The show plays with his age for comic effect, making him childlike when it is funny, and adult when it is necessary. The result is a character whose actual life history is impossible to pin down. We do not know how old he was when he started working at the shack. We do not know how old he is when the show begins. We do not know whether he has, by the end of the show, been at the shack for 5 years or 15. He is roughly 20-something, and the rest is fuzzy. Seuss's father is another character whose timeline is essentially impossible. The show implies that Seuss's father abandoned him when he was very young, that Seuss has spent his life waiting for him to come back, that the father has consistently promised to visit on Seuss's birthday and never shown. The implication is decades of repeated promises. But Seuss is 20-something, and the show treats his abandonment as the defining wound of his life. Either his father has been absent since Seuss was an infant, or the pattern of broken promises has been going on for most of Seuss's life, or both. The show plays the wound for emotional weight without ever quite specifying its mechanics. The result is a backstory that hits you in the gut and falls apart when you try to date it. The summer itself, internally, contains another contradiction. The show begins with the kids arriving at the shack in early June, more or less. The show ends with the kids leaving at the end of August, on their 13th birthday. By most accounts in the show, their birthday lands on the very last day of summer, the day before they are due to return home, and the show needs that birthday and the going home moment to share a single emotional beat. But other moments in the second half of the season treat their birthday as a date the family has already been preparing for through earlier weeks. The compressed birthday is the kind of thing that only matters if you are looking. It is a real fiddle. The show wants the birthday and the leaving to land together, and bends the calendar a little to make it happen. The final timeline problem is the question of how Ford has aged. Ford, the show tells us, was sucked through the portal 3 decades before the events of the show. When he comes back, he is roughly the same age as Stan, who has been living a normal life in the third dimension during those years. Ford has clearly been busy in the multiverse, fighting Bill, traveling between dimensions, building weapons, gathering allies. He should, plausibly, have aged at a different rate. The show implies that 3 decades passed for him too, which would put him in his 60s when he returns. He looks roughly his 60s, fine. But the show also implies that the dimensions he has been moving through have different time flows, that he has spent subjective decades in some places, that he has been hunted across realities. None of that subjective elapsed time shows on his face. Either the dimensions he has been in have all run at roughly Earth time, or his aging has been suppressed by exotic dimensional effects, or the show is simply not committing to a real model of how time has flowed for him. The latter is most likely. The result is a Ford who has been gone for 3 decades and looks like it, but has also lived adventures that should have taken longer than that, and the show simply does not address how those two things fit together. From people we move to creatures, because the bestiary of Gravity Falls is its own pile of unanswered questions, and the show's relationship with its own monsters is more contradictory than the lore tends to admit. Ford's journals document, by his own estimate, hundreds of distinct supernatural entities living in the woods around the town. The show, across 40 episodes, depicts gnomes, manitars, lake monsters, pterodactyls, ghosts, zombies, vampires only by implication, the shapeshifter, the multi-bear, unicorns, fairies, the hide-behind, mermen, the wax figures, the summerween trickster, gremloblins, leprechauns, and a very long etc. The creatures are one of the show's great pleasures. They are also, when you start to think about them seriously, a logistical nightmare for the world the show wants to inhabit. Start with the gnomes. The gnomes are introduced in the very first episode, where they attempt to kidnap Mabel and marry her to their gnome king. They are presented as a substantial community living in the woods around the shack, with a hierarchy, a culture, and a habit of disguising themselves as humans by climbing on each other's shoulders. The trouble is that the gnomes, once introduced, never really go away. They are, by the show's implication, omnipresent. They are in the woods every day. They are within walking distance of the shack, and yet the entire town goes about its business, day after day, without ever interacting with them. The townspeople pass through the woods. The kids go camping in the woods. Tourists hike through the woods. None of them, in the regular flow of the show, ever encounter the gnomes. The gnomes are a threat when the plot needs them, and invisible when the plot does not. The Society of the Blind Eye explanation only goes so far. There are simply too many gnomes, in too many places, for the town to be unaware of them. The show treats them, sometimes, as if they live in a hidden pocket dimension that only opens when the writers want a gnome scene. They do not actually live in such a pocket. They live in the woods. The manitars have the same problem. The manitars are an entire society of muscle-bound minotaurs living in a cave, with a leadership structure, a religion centered on physical aggression, and a hostility to outsiders. They are big, they are loud, they are not subtle, and they live, the show implies, within hiking distance of the town. The pterodactyl, similarly, lives in a hidden cavern with its baby for thousands of years and only emerges when a particular plot device disturbs it. The lake monster, which turns out to be a series of mechanical fakes built by Stan, also lives in the lake. The actual lake monster, which is real, also lives in the lake. Both of them, somehow, share a small body of water without either being noticed by the local fishing community. The multi-bear is even stranger. The multi-bear is a large, multi-headed bear creature who lives in a cave, has cultural opinions about pop music, and only barely escapes being killed by Dipper in one of the more memorable episodes. He is the size of a barn. He lives near the trails. He is not particularly hidden, and yet nobody in town has ever stumbled onto him, ever photographed him, ever called him in to the authorities. The multi-bear lives, essentially, in a kind of polite arrangement with the town's blindness. The show implies that the town's tendency to ignore the supernatural is partly the society's doing and partly a kind of cultural blind spot, a way of refusing to see what is in front of them. That works for some of the creatures, the small and easily missed ones. It does not work as well for the giant ones who live next door. The shapeshifter is its own particular plot hole. The shapeshifter, introduced in the back half of Season 2, is a creature that has been frozen for 3 decades in a hidden bunker, sealed in by Ford himself, awaiting whoever might wander in. The shapeshifter is fluent in everything Ford knows, fluent in things Ford never told anyone, fluent in events that happened in the third dimension while it was frozen. It taunts Dipper with information about the future, things that have not happened yet, things that Dipper himself does not know. Where exactly has it been getting this information from? The show implies that the shapeshifter has some kind of dimensional awareness, that it can read minds, that it can predict outcomes, but the rules of its abilities are never spelled out. It simply seems to know what the writers need it to know in any given scene. Its taunting prophecy at the end of its episode, when it predicts a moment from the show's actual finale, is one of the most famously chilling moments in the show. It also has no clear in-show explanation. The shapeshifter, frozen for 3 decades, predicts the future. The audience accepts it because it is creepy. The mechanism is, in essence, magic. The wax figures present a different kind of plot hole. They are introduced in the 2nd episode of the show as a set of wax statues at the Mystery Shack, who come alive at night and attempt to murder Grunkle Stan over a perceived insult. They are introduced as a 1-episode threat, defeated by Dipper at the end of the episode. They are also, structurally, supernatural beings whose existence has never been explained. We do not know who animated them. We do not know who made them. We do not know whether they have always been alive or whether they were activated by some specific event. The show treats them as a one-off threat and never returns to them. They are simply alive, simply hostile, simply present, with no backstory. They imply a category of supernatural entity, the cursed objects of Gravity Falls, that the show could have explored further and chose not to. They are one of many threads the show abandons quickly. The ghosts of the Dusk to Dusk are another such thread. The ghosts of the convenience store are introduced as the spirits of 2 old shopkeepers who died of shame and now haunt the place. The show treats them as comedic at first and then as genuinely dangerous, climaxing in a possession scene with Stan that is among the most disturbing in the show's run. After their episode is over, the ghosts disappear. We never see them again. The convenience store, by the show's implication, presumably remains haunted. The fate of the ghosts is unclear. The mechanism of their banishment, if there was one, is unclear. The show treats them as a problem to be solved in a single episode and then quietly removes them from the world. The Northwest Curse, which we will discuss further in a later section, also raises ghost questions. The Northwest Manor is haunted by the spirit of a lumberjack who was killed by the Northwest family and who has returned to extract a long-delayed promise. The lumberjack ghost is, by the show's logic, a very specific kind of revenant, the kind whose existence depends on a specific historical injustice. But he is the only such ghost in the entire town's history that the show ever depicts. Gravity Falls, given its other supernatural density, should presumably be full of such ghosts. There should be a graveyard full of them. There should be a small ghostly army at any given moment. The show, however, treats the Northwest ghost as an anomaly. He is the only ghost of his kind. The mechanism of his arrival, the conditions of his banishment, the rules that govern his existence, are all specific to him. The show does not generalize. The vampires are perhaps the most charmingly inconsistent of all the creatures. The show implies, in flashes, that vampires exist in Gravity Falls. Mabel goes to a vampire-themed party. Various characters refer to vampires. Ford's journal mentions them. And yet across 40 episodes, we never see one on screen, never have a vampire plotline, never have a vampire character. They are, essentially, a piece of background flavor that the show kept promising and never delivered. This is a soft plot hole, not a contradiction, but an unmet expectation. The show keeps gesturing at a category of monster it does not actually use. The unicorns are the opposite case. The unicorns are introduced late in Season 2, in an episode that has divided fans for almost a decade. They are presented as terrible. They are pompous, cruel, and dishonest. They protect a sacred grove with magical wards. They give up their hair only to those who have proven themselves morally pure, but their definition of moral purity is a deliberate trick designed to humiliate visitors. Mabel, in particular, is put through a series of indignities by the unicorns before the kids finally just beat the magic out of them and take the hair by force. The hair is then used to construct the protective barrier around the shack in preparation for Bill's arrival. The unicorns themselves are last seen humiliated and defeated. They never reappear. They are introduced specifically to provide the magic substance the show needs for the finale, used and discarded. The leprechauns, the gremloblins, the gobblewonker, the summerween trickster, all of these creatures are introduced for a single episode each, solved and never seen again. The bestiary of Gravity Falls is, in practice, much smaller than the journals claim. Ford writes about hundreds of species. The show shows us about 3 dozen. The disparity is partly the natural compression of any TV show, the difference between what a fictional researcher could have cataloged and what a TV production could afford to animate. But it is also a structural plot hole. The town is meant to be, by its own internal mythology, a supernatural epicenter, the densest concentration of weirdness on the continent. The actual texture of the show suggests that most of the weirdness is one-offs, that the supernatural density of Gravity Falls is largely off-screen, that the journals are bigger than the world they describe. The show is, in this sense, a tease of a larger world that does not quite exist. The gnomes themselves carry one more puzzle, the matter of their biology. They are introduced as creatures whose internal anatomy is unusual. They climb on each other to form a tall man. They have a queen. They have a courtship structure. They reproduce somehow. They eat squirrels. They are, in the world of the show, an entire functioning culture. But the show never quite explains how they reproduce, who their actual parents are, whether they age, whether they die, whether their society has any history. The gnomes simply exist, as if they have always existed, with no clear origin story and no clear future. They are a piece of magical fauna that the show inserted into its first episode and then forgot to develop. The same is true of most of the show's creatures. They are present, they have personalities, and they have no real ecology. The final creature plot hole worth highlighting is the question of the gobblewonker, the lake monster Seuss believes in, and that Dipper and Mabel hunt with him in an early episode. The gobblewonker in the episode turns out to be a robot, built by Old Man McGucket as a way of getting his son's attention. A cute resolution. But the lake also contains, somewhere in the larger lore, an actual lake monster, established in the journals and depicted in later episodes. So both things are true. There is a gobblewonker. There is a fake gobblewonker. They coexist in the same lake. The fake one is built by a man who lives on a houseboat on the lake, presumably, near the real one, presumably, without either ever encountering the other. The two stories simply do not interact. The lake monster is one of those background elements that the show uses for tone and never quite reconciles with its own earlier episodes. From the creatures we move to one of the show's most fascinating villains, and to the question that the show essentially refuses to resolve about him. Gideon Gleeful is the child psychic at the Tent of Telepathy, a small boy with a beehive of white hair and a powder blue suit, who operates a local stage show in which he claims to read minds, predict futures, and channel spirits. Gideon is, by the show's own admission, a charlatan. He uses earpieces and informants to fake his psychic readings. He sells his act on theatricality and emotional manipulation. He is, in essence, a junior Stan Pines, a con artist whose business model is psychic fakery. And then, partway through Season 1, Gideon picks up a real magical amulet, the telekinetic amulet, a piece of jewelry that gives him genuine power over physical objects. The amulet allows him to lift things with his mind, throw enemies around, and project a green aura of force around himself when he uses it. The amulet is the thing that turns Gideon from a comedic local nuisance into a real threat. The kids steal the amulet, destroy it, and disarm him. Gideon, deprived of his magic, becomes again the small boy he always was, a child with theatrical ambitions but no actual gifts. The plot hole is the question of what was going on before the amulet. Gideon, in his first major episodes, performs feats that go well beyond the limits of stage magic. He correctly predicts events that no shill could feed him. He produces small physical effects in the air around him. He manipulates objects in subtle ways. The show, when it eventually addresses these things, implies that they were all stagecraft, that any apparent psychic activity was either an earpiece tip or an effect produced by the amulet, depending on the episode. But the timeline of when Gideon got the amulet is unclear. He has it when we meet him. He has had it long enough to use it. He keeps it hidden in his bolo tie. The implication is that he has had it for at least a year, maybe more, and that his tent of telepathy business has long been backed by genuine magic, supplied by the amulet, masquerading as psychic talent. If that is the case, then the amulet itself is the real engine of the early Gideon plotlines. And the amulet, the show eventually reveals, was found by Gideon in a cave somewhere outside the town, marked by symbols the show never fully explains. The amulet is, by every implication, an ancient artifact, possibly of the same vintage as the gnomes and the other ancient supernatural elements of the town. Yet Ford's journals do not mention it. Ford, who cataloged everything else, missed an active magical artifact whose user lives 1 mile from his front door. The journals are silent on the telekinetic amulet. Ford never mentions Gideon. Ford never warns Stan that the town's child psychic is wielding real magic. The amulet exists in a kind of canonical gap, untracked by the journals, unconfronted by the show's lore expert, and only ever addressed by the kids in the moment of its destruction. Then there is the question of what Gideon does after the amulet is destroyed. He continues to be a real threat for the rest of the show. He acquires Journal 2. He attempts to break into the Mystery Shack. He attempts to enlist Bill Cipher's help. He nearly succeeds in obtaining the deed to the shack. He is, in the back half of the show, the engine of the larger Bill plot, because his deal with Bill is part of how Bill begins to gain influence on the human side of the dimensional barrier. Gideon, despite being a powerless child, manages all of this. He manages it through manipulation, persuasion, leverage, and small acts of cleverness, which is fine. But the show keeps treating Gideon as essentially a threat tier above what his actual resources should allow. He has the tent. He has a few followers. He has, briefly, Journal 2. He should be a nuisance. The show treats him as a major adversary. The mechanism of his menace is, in the back half, almost entirely the favor Bill extends to him, which is itself a function of Bill's wider plan. Gideon is, in essence, a piece of furniture in Bill's scheme. The show wants him to be a villain on his own terms. The math does not quite work. His parents are another puzzle. Gideon's father, Bud Gleeful, is depicted as a used car salesman who is terrified of his own son. Gideon's mother is essentially mute throughout the series, depicted as a woman so beaten down by her family that she cannot make eye contact. The show plays this for dark comedy, the implication being that Gideon's tyranny over his household is its own kind of horror. But the family dynamic is essentially inexplicable. Bud is much larger than Gideon. Bud is an adult. Bud has, presumably, legal authority over his young son, and yet Bud treats Gideon as an autonomous criminal mastermind whose decisions cannot be overruled. The show plays this for laughs and pathos. The realistic mechanics of how a small child managed to take over his own household without ever being subject to any meaningful adult control are never explained. We are simply told that this is how the Gleeful house works. We are asked to find it funny rather than to investigate it. The Gideon storyline is also the place where the show makes one of its most famously inconsistent moves. After he is arrested at the end of his arc, Gideon is sent to prison, where he becomes, somehow, the leader of a hardened prison crew, a small child commanding adult inmates with charisma alone. The visual is comic. The implications are absurd. Either the prison system in Oregon is run with extraordinary laxity, allowing a child to be housed with adult criminals, or Gideon is in a juvenile facility, but the show stages it as an adult prison for joke purposes. The latter is almost certainly what is happening, and the joke is funny, but it is also a fairly substantial bit of cheating with the world. Gideon, in real terms, would not be in a state prison. He would be in a juvenile facility with no adult inmates to lead. The show wants the image of a tiny boy commanding hardened convicts. It plants that image regardless of whether the world it has built can really support it. His eventual redemption is also rapid and lightly motivated. Gideon, by the time of Weirdmageddon, has decided to help the heroes save the town. The shift is presented as the result of his experience in prison, his realization that his obsession with Mabel was wrong, and his admiration for the kids who beat him. Fine, but the timeline of this redemption is very short. He is in prison for, by the show's implication, only a few weeks. He emerges from it morally transformed. The show is unwilling to spend the time it would take to make this transformation feel earned, so it simply asserts it. Gideon goes from a villain to an ally in the space of essentially one decision. The transformation is, in the end, more of a narrative convenience than a piece of character development. The show needs him on the right side for the finale, so he is on the right side for the finale. The mechanism is mostly implied. The final Gideon plot hole is the most interesting. The show keeps suggesting that Gideon has, beyond the amulet, some kind of subtle but real psychic sensitivity. He picks up on emotional currents. He correctly identifies feelings nobody has told him about. He has access to insights that mere observation should not provide. The amulet, when it is in his hand, does not seem to explain these insights, which feel more like the perceptions of someone who is at least mildly sensitive to mental energy. The show never quite commits to whether Gideon is a real psychic or a fake. It plays both. In some scenes, he is clearly a fraud relying on tricks. In other scenes, he says things he could not possibly know. The implication, perhaps, is that he has a small genuine gift, amplified by the amulet, that the show is too coy to declare openly. Or the implication is that the show simply wrote whatever felt right in each scene and never built a coherent model of his abilities. Either way, the question of what Gideon Gleeful actually is, of where his power ends and his charlatanry begins, remains one of the show's most unresolved character questions. He is its little villain, and the show keeps him deliberately mysterious. From Gideon we go to the family that owns the mansion, because the Northwest plotline is its own particular pile of broken timelines and unanswered questions. The Northwest family, in the show's world, founded the town of Gravity Falls roughly 150 years before the events of the series, an event commemorated by an annual party they hold at their mansion. Pacifica Northwest, the daughter of the current generation, is introduced in the first season as Mabel's rival, a wealthy queen bee character who serves as the show's preppy antagonist. By the second season, she has been redeemed, integrated into the main friend group, and revealed as a victim of her own family's worst instincts. The arc itself is one of the show's most affecting. The lore around it is one of its most loose. The show's big Northwest reveal is the ghost. The Northwest Manor, by the second season, is depicted as haunted by the ghost of a lumberjack who was tricked and killed by the Northwest founder in the 1860s, when the Northwests promised to throw an annual party for the town and then reneged on the deal once they had the land. The lumberjack's ghost waits roughly 150 years to extract his promise, returning on the anniversary to terrorize the family and demand that the gates be opened to the entire town. Dipper and Pacifica eventually solve the haunting by opening the gates, fulfilling the original promise, and freeing the ghost. The first plot hole here is the question of why the lumberjack waited. Ghosts in fiction can be capricious, but the show implies that the lumberjack's binding is mechanical, that he is required to return on the anniversary, that the curse has been active since his death. If that is the case, the Northwests should have had a long string of annual visits from a furious lumberjack ghost, not a single dramatic one. Each year, on the anniversary, he should have appeared, made his demands, and either been satisfied or banished. Either the curse activated only once, in which case the timing is essentially arbitrary, or the Northwests had been suffering through annual hauntings for a century and a half, in which case the show's silence on the previous instances is bizarre. The implication, in some readings, is that the curse activates only at certain intervals, or only on this specific anniversary, but the show does not commit to that explanation either. The lumberjack simply arrives when the plot needs him. The Northwest family, by the show's implication, has been operating with shocking cruelty for generations. They have exploited the town, betrayed it, lied to it, repeatedly. If betrayal of the town produces revenant lumberjacks, the manor should be standing room only, with ghosts of every kind. The fact that only one such curse haunts the family suggests that there is something specific about the lumberjack episode that gave rise to the ghost, but the show never explains what that something is. The lumberjack is the only such revenant. He is the only consequence the family ever faces. The rest of their crimes go unpunished by the supernatural side of the town. The Northwest Mansion itself has its own continuity problems. The mansion, the show implies, has been in the family for over a century, an enormous Gothic structure with multiple wings, secret passages, hidden rooms, and an underground vault. It is shown to contain a complete art collection, a library, multiple ballrooms, and a maze of corridors. The mansion is, by every visual implication, one of the largest private residences in the state of Oregon. The Northwest family, while wealthy, are not infinitely wealthy. They are local rich, not international rich. Their fortune, by the show's own implication, has been declining for some time, with the family essentially trading on its name rather than its assets. A mansion of this size requires a staff in the dozens, a maintenance budget in the millions, and a continuous flow of cash that the Northwest family does not really seem to have. The mansion exists, the way fairy tale mansions exist, without a real financial substrate behind it. The collapse of the Northwest fortune, when it comes, is also strangely complete. After Weirdmageddon, the family loses everything, and the mansion is somehow purchased by old man McGucket, who moves in by the end of the show. The mechanism by which McGucket acquires the mansion is never depicted. We do not see the auction. We do not see the foreclosure. We do not see the family's exit. They simply lose the house, and McGucket takes it, and the show treats this as a kind of poetic justice. The poetic justice works. The literal mechanics are essentially invisible. Pacifica herself is the next Northwest puzzle. Pacifica, the daughter of the family, is introduced as Mabel's rival, a confident bully with a great deal of social capital. By the second season, she is revealed to be a deeply unhappy child who has been raised to behave in a certain way by parents who openly demean her. The redemption arc is well done. The implication, however, is that Pacifica has been performing her role for years, that the cracks in her facade are new, that the kindness she eventually shows has been buried under years of grooming. The show wants us to read her as essentially decent at heart, simply broken by her upbringing. That works. But it also raises the question of why nobody at her school, in her community, in her larger world, has ever noticed this before. Pacifica has friends. Pacifica has acquaintances. Pacifica has, presumably, teachers. The implication that nobody saw her as a real person until Dipper looked at her with sympathy is romantic, but it also suggests a social environment in which children are essentially invisible to the adults around them, which, in fairness, is one of the show's recurring themes. But the specific lack of supportive adults in Pacifica's life is a continuity oddity, given how many adults supposedly know her. The family's founding myth is the next layer. The show tells us, late in the run, that the Northwest founder did not actually found the town. The actual founder was someone else, a humble man whose story was suppressed by the Northwest family in favor of their own. The Northwests took credit. They built statues. They wrote it into the local history. This is a satisfying piece of social commentary about how dominant families rewrite the past. It also creates a strange continuity issue with the lumberjack curse. The lumberjack was, supposedly, killed by the Northwests because he refused to keep their secret about the original founding. If that is the case, then his curse is tied not to the broken party promise, but to the founding lie itself. The show's two reveals about the Northwest family, the lumberjack curse and the fake founding, do not quite mesh. They are presented in different episodes with different implied mechanisms, and the show does not really tie them together. They are both real, both Northwest secrets, both spilled in the back half of the show, and they essentially exist in parallel rather than as parts of a unified story. The last Northwest plot hole is the smallest. Pacifica's parents, when threatened, can summon her to attention by ringing a small bell. The bell is treated, by the show, as a kind of horrifying conditioning device, a Pavlovian trigger that activates her trained obedience. The implication is that she has been conditioned since childhood to respond to the bell, that her body reacts before her mind does. This is gothic and dark and works well. The detail the show never quite addresses is who, exactly, conditioned her. The bell training implies a specific moment of childhood torment, a specific conditioning process. We never see it. We do not know how long it lasted. We do not know what age she was when it began. The bell, like so many of the Northwest details, is a piece of evocative imagery that the show plants and never quite explains. The horror of it is real. The specific mechanics behind the horror are left to the viewer to fill in. The Northwests, in this sense, are a great example of the show's preferred storytelling mode. They are emotionally rich and mechanically vague. The show trusts you to feel them. It does not trust itself to spell out everything they imply. From the Northwests, we move to the apocalypse itself, because Weirdmageddon is the show's grand climax, and also the densest single concentration of unanswered questions in the entire series. Weirdmageddon is the 3-episode finale arc that closes out the second season, in which Bill Cipher manages to enter the third dimension through the rift, transforms Gravity Falls into a hellscape, gathers a cabinet of demonic henchmen from across the multiverse, and attempts to spread his weirdness across the entire planet. It is one of the most ambitious finales in modern animation. It is also, when you start to look closely, an episode that frequently breaks its own rules in service of its own scale. The first Weirdmageddon plot hole is the boundary. Bill, after he enters our dimension and takes over the town, finds that his weirdness has a strange geographic limit. The chaos extends only to the borders of Gravity Falls itself, ending in a kind of force field around the town. Anything outside the town remains normal. This is presented as the result of an unspecified dimensional rule, the implication being that Bill's power, in this dimension, is somehow tied to the town in a way that prevents it from spreading further. The show needs this rule for 2 reasons. First, it limits Bill's destruction to a manageable scale that the heroes can address. Second, it explains why the rest of the world does not show up to deal with him. If the catastrophe were global, the heroes would be insignificant. If the catastrophe were national, there would be a military response. By limiting it to a small town, the show keeps the conflict local. The problem is that the show never actually explains why the boundary exists. The implication is that Gravity Falls is, like many supernatural epicenters in fiction, a place where dimensional walls are thinner, and that Bill's power exploits that thinness. But thinness in walls does not usually mean that the disturbance stays inside them. Bill, having arrived, should presumably be capable of moving. He should be able to walk down the road. He should be able to fly. He should be able to manifest in a neighboring town. He does not, and the show implies he cannot, but the actual rule is never written down. It is essentially a piece of plot armor for the rest of the world. The second Weirdmageddon plot hole is the speed of the response. Bill takes over the town, he builds a fortress, he summons henchmen, he alters reality, he kidnaps Ford, he pursues the heroes, he nearly catches them, and the rest of the world does nothing. The federal government, which has had agents in town for half the season, vanishes entirely. The Oregon state government does not respond. The military does not arrive. The news does not cover it. The catastrophe is, from the outside, essentially invisible. The show's implicit explanation is that Bill's weirdness extends to perception as well as physical space, that the outside world simply cannot see what is happening inside the boundary, that the town has been quarantined from outside attention by the same field that quarantines the chaos. This is a generous reading. The show does not state it, but it is the only reading that makes the absence of outside response plausible. There is also the question of Bill's henchmen. Bill, when he enters our dimension, summons a small cabinet of allies, demonic figures with various powers and themes. They include Pyronica, the pink fire demon. They include 8-Ball, the 8-ball-headed brute. They include Teeth, the floating mouth. They include Kryptos and Amorphous Shape, and Hectorgon, and Pachyfire, and Xanthar. Each of these has a name in the show's marketing and a brief on-screen appearance during the apocalypse. They are essentially Bill's interdimensional crew. Where exactly have they come from? The show implies that they are friends Bill has accumulated across his travels, fellow inhabitants of the multiverse who answer his call when he finally breaches the third dimension. Some of them, by most accounts pieced together by fans, have been with him for centuries. None of them, however, are individually developed. They have names and looks and almost no characterization. They exist as a set piece, a cabinet of evil. They are introduced and then more or less wasted as background detail. The plot hole is not that they exist, but that the show insists, in supporting material, that they are major characters in the larger lore, while doing nothing on screen with them. The implication of depth is much greater than the depth itself. The pyramid, Bill's pyramidal headquarters that hovers above the town, is another piece of the apocalypse that the show treats as solid lore, but does not really explain. Bill summons it, apparently out of thin air, in the moments after his arrival. It is enormous. It is made of an unspecified substance. It is decorated with the iconography of his cult. It has a throne room, prison cells, a torture chamber, and various other facilities. Where did it come from? How was it built? What is it made of? The show simply produces it and lets it loom. It is a piece of evil furniture, summoned on demand. The implicit explanation is that Bill, having achieved physical form in the third dimension, has reality warping powers that allow him to manifest such structures. Fine. But if he has reality warping powers, then most of the other things in the apocalypse should be easier for him to do. He should be able to manifest his way out of the unicorn hair barrier. He should be able to manifest his way through Ford's metal plate. He should be able to manifest the rest of the planet into chaos directly. The pyramid is one of the moments where Bill's powers, in their full extent, are demonstrated, and the demonstration suggests a villain who should be far more dangerous than the rest of the finale allows him to be. The kidnapping of the townspeople is another piece of the apocalypse the show does not quite work through. Bill, during Weirdmageddon, captures dozens of townspeople and turns them into stone statues, which then become part of his throne. The statues are real people, real bodies, real lives, frozen in mid-scream, and incorporated into the architecture of the pyramid. The show treats this as horrifying, which it is. The show also treats this as reversible, in that the statues are restored at the end when Bill is defeated. The mechanism by which the statues come back to life, the question of whether they have been conscious the whole time, the question of whether they remember being statues, is essentially set aside. The townspeople come back, take stock, and move on. The trauma of having been petrified for days, of having watched the apocalypse from inside their own stone bodies, of having been incorporated into the pyramid's furniture, is never depicted. The show treats them as if they had been on a brief, unpleasant vacation. The horror is allowed to be horror only until the show is ready to be done with it. The kids' encounters with the henchmen are also strangely uneven. In one scene, Dipper and Wendy escape from Gideon's prison gang almost without effort. In another scene, Mabel survives an entire fake universe in her bubble. In another scene, Stan and Ford manage to walk into the pyramid through the front door with a kind of bravado that should have gotten them caught instantly. The henchmen, who are supposedly powerful interdimensional demons, are repeatedly outwitted by 12-year-olds. The implication is that they are minions, not equals, not really Bill's peers but his entourage. That is fine, but it does suggest that Bill's cabinet, when laid against the show's heroes, is essentially decorative. They are scary in concept, useless in practice. The threat of the apocalypse is mostly Bill himself, with the henchmen filling out the visual space around him. The Zodiac is the largest Weirdmageddon plot hole. The Zodiac is a magical circle, depicted on the cover of Journal 3, that supposedly contains the key to defeating Bill. It consists of 10 symbols, each one corresponding to a member of the central cast, that, when joined together, can banish Bill from the third dimension. The show spends substantial time setting this up, having Ford explain it, having the kids prepare for it, having the characters gather to perform it. And then, when the moment of the ritual arrives, it fails. Stan and Ford argue, the chain of hands is broken, the Zodiac does not work. Having spent so much time on it, the show simply abandons it and finds another way to defeat Bill, the memory gun trick we discussed earlier. The Zodiac, in other words, is a Chekhov's gun that the show points at the audience for several episodes and then declines to fire. It was the plan. The plan does not work. A new plan replaces it. This is, on one level, good writing. The failure of the Zodiac is dramatic. It forces the heroes into a more desperate, more personal solution. The brothers, having broken the ritual through their own bitterness, have to make up for it by sacrificing themselves directly. The moment lands, but the Zodiac itself is left dangling. Was it ever real? Was it really the only way to defeat Bill? Would it have worked if the brothers had not fought? The show does not answer. It introduces the Zodiac, exploits the audience's expectation that it will be used, and then quietly retires it as a red herring. The Zodiac becomes one of the show's most famous unfinished symbols. Fans have spent years arguing about what the symbols mean, who they refer to, whether they could have worked. The show, having moved on to its actual resolution, never comes back to clarify. The defeat of Bill himself is the largest Weirdmageddon plot hole of all. Bill, having been tricked into Stan's mind, is supposedly destroyed when Ford erases Stan's memories. The destruction is dramatic and complete. Bill, the show says, is gone. The third dimension is safe. And yet the show, in its closing credits, includes a small final flourish that has been the source of fan speculation for the entire decade since. A statue of Bill, in his triangular form, is shown sitting in the forest after the events of the finale, partly buried, presumably the petrified remains of his physical form. The implication, depending on how you read it, is that Bill is still out there in some form, that he can be revived, that the defeat was not as total as the show claimed. Whether that is canon or simply a hint, whether it points to a real continuation or simply a thematic gesture, the show refuses to say. The defeat of Bill is, like the defeat of every great mystery box villain, deliberately ambiguous. The plot hole is the gap between his apparent destruction and his potential survival. The show, asked to pick one, picks both. Bill is dead. Bill might not be dead. The show's last gesture about its biggest villain is essentially a shrug. Mabel's bubble is the next piece worth pausing on. During Weirdmageddon, Mabel is captured by Bill and placed in a kind of paradise prison, a bubble in which everything she has ever wanted comes true. It is one of the show's most psychologically complex sequences, a meditation on the way Mabel fears growing up, the way she would rather stay in summer forever than face the autumn that is coming. Inside the bubble, time slows. Inside the bubble, characters are simulated. Inside the bubble, Mabel almost gives up. The bubble itself, however, raises questions. How is the bubble constructed? How does Bill power it? What happens to the simulated characters inside it when the bubble is destroyed? The show treats the bubble as a piece of pure visual storytelling and largely declines to address its mechanics. The simulated Dipper inside the bubble, who is in some sense a real character with thoughts and feelings, is essentially deleted at the end. The other simulations are similarly retired. The show's logic of the bubble is emotional, not mechanical. It works as a metaphor. It does not work as a piece of physics. There is also the question of how the heroes escape from the pyramid as easily as they do once they have Bill in Stan's mind. The pyramid, before the final scene, is depicted as essentially impregnable. Bill controls reality inside it. Henchmen patrol it. Captives hang from the walls. And yet, in the final moments, the heroes simply walk out, having defeated Bill, and the pyramid evaporates. The mechanism is the death of the villain. Cut the head off, the snake dies. Fine. But the speed with which the apocalypse undoes itself is, like the speed of the memory gun finale, almost too clean. The town comes back together. The statues come back to life. The henchmen vanish. The boundary dissolves. Within minutes, Gravity Falls is essentially the place it was before, minus a few burnt buildings and a great deal of trauma. The apocalypse, having taken 3 episodes to set up, is undone in a single scene. The audience accepts it because the emotional beats land, the mechanical questions are quietly dropped. From the apocalypse, we move sideways into the show's time travel plotlines, because the time travel mechanics of Gravity Falls are some of the most beautifully written and most internally inconsistent things in the entire series. Gravity Falls features at least 3 significant time travel storylines. The first is the introduction of Blendon Blandon, the time travel agent who arrives in town in the episode The Time Traveler's Pig, only to be tricked into giving Dipper and Mabel his time-traveling device. The second is the episode in which they go back to a country fair and try to alter the past, with predictable consequences. The third is the late-season storyline involving Time Baby, the giant infant emperor of all of time, and the Time Police, who arrive in town to stop the heroes from breaking history. The first time travel plot hole is the question of how the device works. The time tape, as it is called, is a wristband that allows the user to travel to any point in time, almost without restriction, by entering the desired date and pressing a button. The tape can carry multiple people. The tape can move forward and backward. The tape can deposit travelers in specific locations as well as specific times. It is one of the most powerful items in the show. And yet, after the kids return it to Blendon at the end of the episode, the tape essentially disappears from the show as a usable device. It comes back briefly in later episodes, but the kids never seriously consider using it again to solve their problems. They never go back and warn their younger selves. They never go back and fix a tragedy. They never use it to avert Bill's arrival. The tape, once introduced, becomes a one-shot plot device that the show then quietly retires. The reason the show retires it is because time travel breaks every plot it touches. If the kids have access to a time machine, then almost every problem in the show has an easy solution. The show, in its first time travel episode, addresses this directly. The kids try to use the tape to alter the past and immediately discover that small changes produce catastrophic ripples. That getting Mabel her pet pig requires Dipper to give up on Wendy. That every change has a cost. The show, in essence, uses the first time travel episode to teach the audience that time travel does not solve anything. It then sets the device aside. But the device returns in the late season finale. Blendin Blandin returns to Gravity Falls to take revenge on the kids for ruining his career, and ultimately becomes a kind of accidental ally during Weirdmageddon. The Time Police, his employers, arrive to address the cataclysm. Time Baby, the leader of all of time, arrives to confront Bill. Bill, in one of the most shocking moments of the show, destroys Time Baby essentially instantly. The destruction of Time Baby is one of the show's most casual atrocities. It is also a piece of internal logic the show never quite addresses. If Time Baby is the master of time, capable of perceiving and altering all temporal flows, then he should have known Bill was coming. He should have been able to step back in time to before Bill arrived. He should have been able to stop Bill in some pre-arrival window. The fact that he is killed in a fair fight, in the present moment, by a creature he should have already addressed in some earlier time, suggests that his control of time is more limited than the show implies. Or it suggests that Bill is somehow outside of time in a way that protects him. Or it suggests that the show simply needed Time Baby dead to make Weirdmageddon feel real. The latter is the most likely. Time Baby is a piece of cosmic furniture that the show uses to establish that even the most powerful beings cannot stop Bill. The way he is removed, however, is more abrupt than the lore around him would suggest. The Time Police themselves raise the next question. Having lost their leader, they presumably have a successor structure, a chain of command, a continued mission. They should arrive in the aftermath of Weirdmageddon to investigate. They should arrest the various parties responsible for the rift. They should impose some kind of cosmic justice. They do none of these things. They disappear from the show. Whether this is because the show has decided that the universe simply rolls on after the cataclysm, or because the Time Police are too busy elsewhere, or because the show simply has no more time to explore them, the result is the same. A massive interdimensional law enforcement agency, introduced as a real institution, leaves the show without any follow-up. The smaller time travel inconsistencies are more interesting. In the first time travel episode, the kids go back to a few hours earlier and meet their younger selves. The younger selves see the older selves. The older selves see the younger selves. They interact. They speak. There is no paradox. The show treats this as comedic, as if the existence of two of you in the same place is just a logistical inconvenience. By standard time travel rules in fiction, this should be a catastrophic violation of physics. The show simply does not care. Later in the show, when time travel comes back up, the rules seem to shift. There are implications that older selves cannot meet younger selves, that paradoxes can be triggered, that certain interventions in the past are impossible. The rules of how time travel works in the show shift episode to episode, depending on what the plot requires. The Time Anomaly, the episode in which the kids and Seuss go back to a country fair, also raises questions about how memory and timeline work together. The kids return to the present after their adventure. They remember the adventure. The world around them does not remember the adventure, because the changes they made were either undone or were small enough that nobody noticed. But Mabel remembers her relationship with the pig she rescued in the past, which was created entirely as a function of the time travel. The pig exists in the present because the kids went back and rescued him. The pig's existence is a function of a time loop. The pig is, in essence, a paradox. The show treats him as simply a pet. The implications of his existence, the question of whether removing the time travel would have removed the pig, are not really addressed. Mabel got her pig. The pig stays. The deeper consequences of the time travel are essentially erased by the show's good humor. Blendin himself turns out to be an extraordinarily complex character, whose backstory is largely implied rather than depicted. He works for an interdimensional time travel bureau in a far future. He has bosses, he has assignments, he has competitors, he has feelings, he has, by the show's implication, a lifetime of work behind him, including years of failures that have damaged his career. The show, in its few episodes featuring him, gives us almost none of this directly. Blendin is, in essence, a sketch of a character with an enormous implied life that the show never has time to depict. The plot hole here is the gap between the implied richness and the depicted reality. Blendin should be a major character. He is, at most, a recurring guest star. The other time travel adjacent plot hole is Mabel's birthday party itself. The party, on which Mabel becomes 13 and Dipper 2, is the moment when the rift gets dropped and Weirdmageddon begins. The party is also, in some sense, a piece of time travel adjacent storytelling because Blendin appears at the party in disguise, as a guest, and uses the chaos as cover to attack the kids. He is then thwarted by the rift dropping and Bill arriving and everything turning into an apocalypse. The plot hole is the question of where Blendon actually was during this whole window. He is presumably traveling through time to confront the kids. He must have known that Bill was about to arrive. He must, in some sense, have already lived through the apocalypse and come back to before it to attack the kids first. The implications of his time travel, applied to the apocalypse, get complicated very quickly. The show, again, simply does not engage. Blendon appears, Blendon participates, Blendon survives, Blendon presumably continues somewhere in the multiverse afterward. The time travel mechanics that would have to underlie his actions are essentially ignored. The largest time travel inconsistency in the show is the question of why Bill, given his described powers, does not travel in time. Bill, the show says, perceives time non-linearly. Bill can see the future. Bill can plan thousands of years in advance. Bill has, in various flashbacks, been operating in the past, the present, and the future at once. If Bill has this ability, then the entire fight against him should be different. The hero's tactics, which depend on Bill being surprised at certain moments, should not work. Bill should already know about the unicorn hair. Bill should already know about the memory gun. Bill should already know about Stan's role in his defeat. The fight against him, in a universe where he is genuinely non-linear, should be essentially impossible. The show solves this by quietly assuming that Bill's non-linearity is limited, that he can see across time but not always clearly, that surprises can still affect him. This is an implicit rule, not an explicit one. The show simply lets him be foolish when it needs him to be foolish, and lets him be omniscient when it needs him to be terrifying. The rule for which is again, mostly emotional rather than mechanical. From time travel, we move into the long, quiet pile of smaller things, the kind of plot holes that do not break the show, but that do reward a careful viewer with little jolts of recognition. These are the contradictions that come from 40 episodes of a show being written in pieces, with different writers on different scripts, with little inconsistencies that nobody had the time to police. They are charming in their way. They are also, when you collect them, surprisingly many. Start with Mabel's pig, Waddles, who is one of the most beloved characters in the show and also one of the most logistically impossible. Waddles is acquired by Mabel at a country fair early in season 1, won as a prize in a contest of some kind. He is, at the moment of his acquisition, a small piglet. He stays a small piglet for essentially the entire show. He never grows. He never reaches the size of a real adult pig. He remains, for the duration of the summer, the same conveniently scaled, animation-friendly size. Real piglets grow rapidly. Within months, they reach considerable size. A pig acquired in early summer would, by the end of summer, be substantially larger than the pig we see on screen. The show, having decided that Waddles is a cute small pig, simply makes him stay that way. The decision is artistic. The decision is also a quiet violation of biology. The way Waddles travels is the next puzzle. Mabel takes him with her to the tent of telepathy, to the Northwest Manor, to the woods, to school events, to the lake, to essentially every location in town. The pig accompanies her without ever being questioned by the adults around them. The town of Gravity Falls treats a 12-year-old girl walking around with a small pig as essentially unremarkable, a thing children do, a thing that is perhaps slightly strange but not worth commenting on. In real life, even a small American town would have at least one person at one of those locations who objected to the pig. The Northwest Manor, in particular, would not let a pig through the door. The tent of telepathy would not allow livestock in the audience. The show, however, treats Waddles as a kind of universal pass, an animal who simply goes everywhere Mabel goes without ever causing a problem. Until Weirdmageddon, when he becomes a giant winged unicorn version of himself, briefly, and then turns back, and the show treats this as essentially a footnote. The question of where Waddles lives when Mabel goes home is the next thread. The show, in its final episode, has Mabel take Waddles back to California with her. The journey is implied to be by car, with Dipper and the kids leaving Gravity Falls together. The pig presumably accompanies them. The pig presumably lives in their California home from that point on. The pig presumably grows, eventually, into a real adult pig who weighs hundreds of pounds. The Pines' parents, who have been entirely absent from the show, are presumably required to accept a new pig into their household. They presumably do. We do not see this. The Pines' parents are, in fact, two of the show's biggest off-screen absences. We hear them on a phone, We hear them mentioned. We never see them. Their relationship to their children, their lives in California, their reactions to the summer are essentially blank. The plot hole here is structural. The show needed the parents to be distant in order for Dipper and Mabel to be free in Gravity Falls. The parents are, accordingly, essentially erased. The cost of this erasure is that the family unit the kids are returning to feels notional rather than real. Sus's grandmother, Abuelita, has a similar issue. Abuelita is depicted as Sus's primary parental figure, an elderly Mexican-American woman who raised him after his father abandoned the family. She lives with Sus. She is gentle. She is sleepy. She has, in a few brief scenes, a quiet wisdom. She also barely exists. We learn essentially nothing about her life before raising Sus, her relationship to his father, her own age, her own history. She is a piece of background that the show treats with warmth but does not develop. The plot hole, again, is structural. Sus's emotional life is supposedly anchored by Abuelita. Her absence from most of the show means that the anchor is mostly off-screen. The show wants us to take her significance on faith. Dipper's hat is the next quiet inconsistency. Dipper, in the show, wears a blue and white trucker hat with a small pine tree on the front, a hat he acquired in the gift shop of the Mystery Shack on his first day in Gravity Falls. The hat becomes essentially the central emblem of his character, the thing that defines his visual identity, the thing he is always wearing. It is, however, a kid's gift shop hat, the kind of inexpensive object that should fall apart, get lost, get destroyed in any of the dozens of adventures Dipper has across the summer. The hat survives a portal explosion, a wax figure fight, a zombie invasion, a possession, an apocalypse, and a fall from substantial heights. By the end of the show, the hat is somehow still in good shape, still on his head, still serving as his emblem. Real hats do not survive this. The show treats it as a kind of character armor. It is, in its small way, a quiet plot hole. Mabel's sweaters are the same. Mabel wears a different sweater in essentially every episode. The sweaters are, by the show's implication, hand-knitted by Mabel herself, with images and phrases relevant to that day's events. She has, across 40 episodes, knitted 40 sweaters, more or less. The implication is that she knits constantly, that she has been knitting since she was small, that her ability to produce sweaters keeps pace with the show's need for sight gags. The mathematics of this are, in fairness, plausible if Mabel is a fast knitter. They are also implausible if you consider that each sweater contains an enormous amount of detail, that each one would take days of work to produce, and that Mabel does not seem to spend significant on-screen time knitting. The sweaters are, essentially, a magical wardrobe that produces what each episode needs. The show treats this with affection rather than concern. Stan's safe is another small contradiction. Stan, in his bedroom, keeps a small safe, in which he stores the most valuable items in the Mystery Shack. Among these items is, at various points, Journal 1, his official paperwork, certain dangerous artifacts, and a small store of cash. The safe is also, at various points, broken into by various characters, opened by accident, found by the kids, and otherwise compromised. The safe's security level varies wildly from episode to episode. In one episode, it is essentially impregnable. In another episode, it can be opened with a combination Dipper guesses correctly. In another episode, it is broken into by Gideon. The mechanism of the safe is whatever the plot needs that day. It is, like many of the show's plot devices, calibrated to the scene rather than to a consistent rule. The Mystery Shack itself has continuity problems. The shack, depending on the episode, has different numbers of rooms, different layouts, different exterior dimensions. The basement is sometimes a small space and sometimes essentially a multi-level industrial facility. The attic, where the kids sleep, is sometimes the only upper room and sometimes one of several. The kitchen is sometimes downstairs and sometimes upstairs. The gift shop varies in size. The exterior of the shack varies in detail. The show's animators, presumably working from rough guidance rather than a strict floor plan, simply redrew the shack as each episode needed. The result is a building whose actual geography is impossible. The shack is bigger on the inside than the outside. The shack is smaller on the inside than the outside. It depends on the episode. Stan's eye patch is in a similar category. Stan, in some episodes, wears an eye patch. In other episodes, he does not. The patch is, presumably, an affectation that comes and goes as he needs it for his Mr. Mystery persona. But the show is not very consistent about when he is in character and when he is not. The eye patch appears on what appears to be his normal eye in some scenes. It disappears in scenes where he should still be in character. The patch is essentially a costume choice that the animators apply or omit depending on the visual needs of the scene. It is not a plot hole in any serious sense. It is, however, a small inconsistency that fans have cataloged. The wider cast has similar small inconsistencies. Wendy's hair is, in various episodes, slightly different lengths. Seuss's shirt is in some episodes a brighter green than in others. Pacifica's earrings change shape. These are the kind of things that any long-running animated show accumulates as the animation team changes hands and the model sheets get updated. They are not significant on their own. They are, taken together, an indication of how the show was built episode by episode, with limited time for full continuity passes. The Mystery Shack's location is another puzzle. The shack, the show implies, is in the woods outside the main town of Gravity Falls, some short driving distance from the town center. The exact distance varies. In some episodes, it is essentially in the middle of town, with characters walking from the shack to the diner in a single scene. In other episodes, it is an isolated cabin in the deep woods, with characters needing to drive for what looks like an hour to reach anyone. The geography of the town, like the geography of the shack itself, is whatever the episode requires. The show treats Gravity Falls as a place where everything is roughly 5 minutes away from everything else when the plot needs it, and roughly an hour away from everything else when the plot needs something different. The local diner, Greasy's Diner, has its own quiet inconsistency. The diner is depicted as being run by Lazy Susan, a kindly waitress with a wandering eye. The diner has a regular clientele. It serves pancakes that are a recurring image in the show. The diner is, however, never given a clear staff beyond Lazy Susan herself. Who cooks the food? Who washes the dishes? Who comes in for the morning shift? The diner runs as a one-woman operation, more or less, despite serving the entire town. This is the kind of inconsistency that small-town animation often produces. It does, however, raise mild questions about how the diner actually functions as a business. Money is another quiet puzzle. Dipper and Mabel are 12. They have no income beyond, presumably, occasional allowance from their parents. And yet they buy things constantly across the show. Mabel buys sweater materials, art supplies, candy, ride tickets, and various other items. Dipper buys investigation supplies, gear, books, food. Neither of them has a job. Neither of them has a stated income. The implication is that Stan has been giving them allowance, but the show does not really show this. The kids simply have money when they need it, and the cost of their adventures is essentially zero. This is fine as television. It is, however, another piece of the show's economy that simply does not balance. There is also a whole category of plot holes that live in the show's relationship with its own genre. The question of how Gravity Falls handles the fact that it is, in essence, a horror show wearing a children's adventure costume. The show contains, across its 40 episodes, a substantial number of scenes that should, by any reasonable reading, be deeply traumatic for the children at the center of it. Dipper is, at one point, possessed by an interdimensional demon and forced to watch his own body be used to inflict pain on his sister. Mabel is, at one point, kidnapped, sealed in a paradise bubble, and slowly tempted into giving up on the real world. Stan is, at one point, captured by his own brother's worst enemy, tortured for information, and threatened with the eternal destruction of his mind. Ford is, at one point, betrayed by his best friend, sucked into another dimension, hunted across realities for 30 years, and returns to find that his replacement has been living his life. The cumulative trauma the cast endures over the course of one summer should be life-altering. The show, in its closing scenes, depicts the kids as essentially unharmed. This is, in part, a function of the genre. Animated children's shows do not, as a rule, dwell on the long-term psychological consequences of fictional violence. The show is operating within a tradition that prefers reset buttons to ongoing trauma. But the cost of this convention is that the apparent stakes of the show, the threats the characters face, the violations they endure, are essentially uncashed by the time the show ends. The kids go home. They presumably have nightmares. They presumably struggle with the experience for the rest of their lives. The show, however, gestures only briefly at this in the closing montage, with images of the kids growing into older versions of themselves, before signing off. The deeper consequence of having lived through Weirdmageddon is essentially deferred, leaving viewers to imagine the long aftermath on their own. The closing montage itself is a piece of the show's most lovely and most quietly inconsistent storytelling. It shows older versions of the central cast with implications about their futures that are deliberately ambiguous. Dipper, in some shots, is depicted as a teenager and then an adult. Mabel similarly grows up. Stan and Ford, older still, are shown on a boat, exploring the world together, having reconciled. The implication is that the cast is going to live full lives after the show ends, that the wounds of the summer will heal, that the family unit at the center of the story will continue. Some of these futures, however, are slightly impossible. Stan and Ford, the show implies, leave together on a long ocean journey at the end of the summer. This is the implication of the final scenes, in which they board a boat and sail off into uncertain waters. The expectation is that they will be gone for years, exploring the world together, fixing their relationship by being away from everything. This is sweet. It is also the kind of arrangement that, for two men in their 60s, is somewhat tenuous. Stan, in particular, has spent 30 years running the Mystery Shack. He has, in the show's own implication, never traveled extensively, never sailed, never been on a long ocean journey. Ford has spent 3 decades in the multiverse, which is its own kind of travel experience, but is hardly the same as managing a small ocean-going vessel. The two of them, departing on a boat without a parent crew, are essentially adopting a lifestyle for which neither is really prepared. The show treats this as a kind of poetic gesture rather than a literal plan. The boat is the symbol of their reconciliation. Whether they can actually sail it is, by implication, a question the show declines to consider. The Mystery Shack itself is the next puzzle, and it is left to Seuss at the end of the show. Seuss becomes the new Mr. Mystery, taking over the family business, putting on the fez, and continuing the operation. Seuss's qualifications for this are, at best, theatrical. He has worked at the shack for years, knows the layout, knows the script. He does not, however, have the con man's instincts that made Stan a success. He does not have the showmanship. He does not have the patter. Seuss is, by every implication, a kind and earnest man who is now expected to run a tourist trap whose entire business model is essentially gentle fraud. Whether the shack can survive under his stewardship is unclear. The show implies it can, with Melody by his side and Abuelita as a kind of mascot. The show does not really examine the question of whether the Mystery Shack, deprived of its founding huckster, is still the Mystery Shack at all. One more aftermath plot hole is worth lingering on, and it is perhaps the show's most quietly painful. The kids leave Gravity Falls at the end of summer. They board a bus. They wave goodbye. They go home to California. The show implies that they will return next summer. The show also implies that the relationships they built in Gravity Falls will persist. Dipper and Wendy will stay friends. Mabel will stay in touch with Pacifica. Stan will write. Ford will visit. The implication is of an ongoing connection that will keep the family of the summer together. In real terms, this is unlikely. The kids are 12, going on 13. Wendy is 15. The age gap will widen as Wendy becomes a young woman and Dipper remains a child. The geographic distance between Oregon and California, in the days before easy video calling, would have made regular contact difficult. The summer, in real terms, was almost certainly a one-off, the kind of formative experience that ends with people drifting apart over the school years that follow. The show, however, refuses to acknowledge this. The implication is that everyone stays in touch, that the family of the summer endures. This is, in its way, the show's gentlest lie. The audience knows that summers like the one depicted on screen do not actually last. The audience knows that the kids will grow up and find new friends, and the summer will become a memory. The show, however, refuses to let the audience feel that loss directly. It offers, instead, an implicit promise that the magic of Gravity Falls will continue forever in some form. The promise is comforting. The promise is also, in the strictest sense, a lie. The show closes on a note of preserved childhood that the math of growing up does not really support. There is, finally, the question of what the show implies about its own future. Gravity Falls ends with several deliberate dangling threads: the statue of Bill in the woods, the mystery of what is in the deepest layers of the bunker, the hints, scattered across supplementary material and creator interviews rather than the show itself, of a possible third Pine sibling that fans have spent years chasing. The question of whether the axolotl, the cosmic being referenced in Bill's final words, will return. The question of whether anyone else from the multiverse will arrive. The show, in essence, ends with an invitation to keep watching the skies. There is no follow-up series. There are supplementary books and a journal that fills in some of the lore. But the main show ends without resolving any of its biggest unanswered questions. The axolotl, in particular, has become a fan obsession. Bill's last words, by most accounts decoded by fans into a coded message, reference an axolotl deity who can be invoked for reversal of certain fates. The axolotl never appears. The axolotl is implied to be cosmically powerful. The axolotl is implied to have a relationship with Bill that the show has not yet shown, and the axolotl is essentially a hook for a continuation that has not arrived. The plot hole, in this case, is more of an open door than a contradiction. The show, having ended, leaves itself the option of coming back. Whether it ever will is, at the time of this video, still a question being asked. There is a quieter, more domestic kind of plot hole worth mentioning, the kind that has nothing to do with the show's lore and everything to do with the daily rhythm of the Mystery Shack. The Shack, as a place of business, opens to the public for tours during the summer. The tours are led by Stan. The tours are attended by tourists who pay for the privilege. The tourists, by every implication, are passing through Gravity Falls in numbers large enough to keep the Shack profitable. And yet the town of Gravity Falls, in the show's general depiction, does not seem to have much of a tourist economy. There is no large hotel. There is no significant restaurant scene. There is no visible infrastructure for the kind of regular tourist traffic the Shack supposedly serves. The show implies that the Shack is essentially the town's only attraction, and that the tourists who come through pass through the town largely on the way to the Shack and back. Where they stay, where they eat, where they buy gas, is essentially invisible. The economic model of the town is, like so many other parts of its background, sketched rather than fleshed out. And then there is the final great open question of the show, the one that fans have been arguing about since the day it ended. The question of whether the show's many small mysteries were ever meant to add up to something larger. The show is full of throwaway lines, background details, brief images that imply a much larger world than the show ever depicts. References to other gods, references to other dimensions, references to other Pines family members, references to specific historical events that the show never explains, references to creatures that the show never shows. These references could be, depending on your reading, either the kind of throwaway world building that any show accumulates, or the deliberate seeding of a larger continuation. The show's creator has, in interviews, suggested both at different times. The result is a show that ended with a deliberate ambiguity about its own size. Was Gravity Falls the whole story, or was it a window into a much larger world? The show, in its final episode, refuses to say. The plot hole, in this final sense, is one of the show's most beloved gifts to its fans. The world of Gravity Falls is, by design, slightly bigger than the show that contained it. The mysteries that the show set up and did not answer are, in some sense, the point. One more set of plot holes is worth lingering on, the kind that exist in specific moments, in specific scenes, that fans have spent years compiling, and that the show essentially trusts the viewer to forgive. These are the moments where the show breaks itself in a single line, a single frame, a single sleight of hand that the writers needed and the viewer absorbs without comment. There is the moment in the early Season 1 episode Headhunters, the wax figure episode, in which a wax statue of Stan's brother is shown on display, before the audience knows that Stan has a brother. The figure is there, presented as a generic display, and only later, after the brother twist is revealed, does the eye go back and notice that it was hidden in plain sight from the beginning. This is, in one sense, beautiful foreshadowing. It is, in another sense, a continuity problem, because Stan would never have built a wax figure of his missing brother and put it on public display in his own tourist trap. The wax figure of Stan's brother exists because the show needed to plant the foreshadowing. The in-show reason for its existence is essentially impossible. The plot hole here is small, the pleasure of the foreshadowing covers it. Seuss's birthday is another small puzzle. The date is revealed in a Season 2 episode as a moment in the calendar Seuss's father has consistently failed to attend, and the show treats the missed birthday as an annual heartbreak. But the show also implies that Seuss is unsure of his exact age, that his life history is somewhat fuzzy, that his sense of when things happened is unreliable. The birthday, in this context, is somehow both a sharp annual fixture and a vague element of his timeline. Seuss's relationship to time is, like his relationship to age, a piece of the show's fuzzy logic that does not really resolve. The question of Bill's cult comes next, the small group of worshippers we see in flashes during the show. The cult is implied to have existed for centuries, with members across the centuries dating back to the founding of the town. The cult has, by implication, members in the present day, possibly including townspeople we have met. The cult is essentially the kind of secret society that the Society of the Blind Eye should have been hunting, given that its existence is precisely the kind of supernatural infiltration the society was founded to prevent. And yet the Bill cult and the Blind Eye, both operating in the same town, never seem to encounter each other. The two secret societies of Gravity Falls, both substantial, both supernatural, both with specific agendas, are essentially unaware of each other for the duration of the show. The plot hole here is the simple fact of their parallel existence. The town has at least two secret organizations that should be at war with each other, and the show never depicts that war. The various government agencies that have been investigating Gravity Falls are the next puzzle. Powers and Trigger are the visible federal agents. Behind them, the show implies, is a much larger apparatus. There are references to the FBI, to the CIA, to military intelligence. The Mystery Shack has, the show implies, been under surveillance for decades. None of this surveillance has produced any actionable intelligence. None of it has resulted in arrests. None of it has prompted a serious raid. The federal apparatus, despite the substantial resources implied, is essentially toothless in the show. It exists primarily as a comic threat, a thing that produces the occasional inconvenience, but never actually exercises the powers that real federal agencies would. This is the kind of inconsistency that any show involving secret agencies tends to produce, but in Gravity Falls it is particularly noticeable because the show takes such pleasure in showing the apparatus's existence without ever letting it act. Robbie's parents, the local funeral directors, are the next quiet puzzle. They have managed to run a funeral home in a town where so many supernatural deaths happen, and yet no supernatural funeral business has ever come up. The funeral home is depicted as a normal, slightly ghoulish small business. Its customers are normal people who have died normal deaths. The constant supernatural mortality of Gravity Falls, however, should mean that the funeral home occasionally handles bodies whose deaths are obviously supernatural. The Society of the Blind Eye, presumably, intervenes in these cases. But the Society's intervention should leave traces, especially on the people who handle the bodies. Robbie's parents, in some episodes, are weirdly cheerful and weirdly normal for people in their position. They are clearly not part of the inner circle of the town's supernatural establishment. They also clearly should know more than they do. The show does not investigate this. It treats the funeral home as a piece of normalcy that exists comfortably within a town that should be making it impossible. The school is the next overlooked institution. Several of the kids' classmates have, over the course of the show, encountered creatures, been possessed, been threatened, been kidnapped. The Society of the Blind Eye, presumably, has zapped them, but the school, as an institution, has not done anything to address the patterns. There is no school counselor processing the trauma of repeated supernatural attacks on students. There is no administrator addressing the constant disruption to the school year. The school, like every other institution in the town, simply rolls forward as if nothing is happening. The plot hole here is the absence of any institutional response to a town that should, by every reasonable count, be in crisis. Pacifica's school in particular is worth a beat. Pacifica, the show implies, attends school in the town, in a class with Dipper and Mabel during the school year. The Northwest family, with its substantial wealth, would in real life almost certainly send Pacifica to a private school, or hire a tutor, or send her to boarding school in a different state. The fact that she attends the local public school is essentially a piece of plot convenience, designed to give her a regular setting in which to interact with the other characters. It is not consistent with what her family would actually do. The show simply asks you not to ask. The Mystery Shack sign is another running gag with a small problem inside it. The sign, depicted in a long-running visual joke, is permanently missing the letter S, so that the place is referred to in passing as the Mystery Hack. The gag is funny. The persistence of the gag, however, implies that nobody has ever fixed the sign, that the letter has been off for the entire duration of the show, that Stan has either chosen not to repair it or has been unable to. The latter is unlikely. The former implies that Stan has decided to leave his business's marquee deliberately damaged. The show does not address this. It just keeps showing the broken sign. The gag is too good to abandon. The Pines' parents, who are essentially invisible in the show, present the final domestic puzzle. They have to receive Mabel and Dipper back at the end of the summer with so many emotional and physical changes. Dipper has, by the time he goes home, grown braver, more confident, more mature. Mabel has, by the time she goes home, processed her fear of growing up. Stan has nearly died. Ford has come back from the multiverse. The Mystery Shack has been the center of a supernatural apocalypse. The kids, returning home, should have a great deal to explain. The parents, presumably, are simply told that the summer was lovely. The lie, if it is a lie, is never depicted. The show ends with the kids on the bus, and the question of what happens when they walk through their front door is left to the imagination. The implication is that the experience of Gravity Falls is, on some level, unshareable. That the magic of the summer has to be kept by those who lived it, and not transmitted to those who did not. That is a beautiful interpretation. It is also a convenient one. The show does not have to write the parental reunion because the show ends before it has to. There is, finally, the question of what is happening in Gravity Falls in the years after the kids leave. The show implies that the town has, in some sense, healed. The supernatural threats are diminished. The villains are defeated. The protective barriers are still in place. But the town is, by every previous implication, sitting on top of a dimensional weak point that has been bleeding weirdness for centuries. The defeat of Bill does not, by any reading the show offers, repair the underlying weakness. The town is still the supernatural epicenter it always was. New creatures should be moving in. New incidents should be happening. The Society of the Blind Eye, having been disbanded, is no longer keeping things quiet. By the math of the show's own world, the town in the years after the show should be experiencing a renewed wave of supernatural activity, with no infrastructure to suppress it. The show implies, instead, that things have settled. The plot hole, in this final case, is the gap between what the show's lore implies and what the show's tone allows. The town is, supposedly, fine. By the lore, it should not be. When you sit with all of this for long enough, when you collect the loose threads, the unanswered questions, the contradictions, the small impossibilities, you start to understand something about why Gravity Falls is the show it is. The plot holes in Gravity Falls are not, for the most part, the result of carelessness. They are the result of ambition. The show built more world than it had time to fully explain. It planted more mysteries than it had episodes to solve. It introduced characters whose lives extended beyond the screen, and creatures whose ecology extended beyond the page. It chose, at every junction, to imply more than to confirm, and the cumulative weight of those implications is the texture of the show. The plot holes are also, in some sense, the show's gift to its audience. A show that closes every loop, that answers every question, that explains every mechanism, leaves nothing for the viewer to do. A show that leaves its world slightly bigger than its plot, that hangs questions in the air, that lets the audience fill in the gaps, is a show that invites a community to live inside it. Gravity Falls, by ending early on purpose, by refusing to over-explain, by trusting its viewers to keep wondering, created the kind of fandom that has spent the last decade decoding ciphers, theorizing about the axolotl, mapping the unconfirmed corners of the lore, and asking the questions the show never quite asked. The plot holes are part of why the show is still being talked about. There is something else worth saying, in the quiet at the end of all this. Gravity Falls is, underneath its mysteries, a show about the end of childhood. The summer ends. The kids grow up. The magic of being 12 becomes the memory of having been 12. The show, by leaving so much undone, captures the feeling that all summers leave behind. You never quite finish a real summer. There is always something you wanted to do that you did not. There is always a friend you meant to know better. There is always a place you meant to go back to. The plot holes in Gravity Falls are, in this final sense, a kind of honesty. The show ends with things undone because real summers end with things undone. The town is left with mysteries because real towns are left with mysteries. The cast goes home with their questions because that is how it actually goes. If you have stayed with us through every contradiction and every loose thread, thank you. Tonight on Pine Hat, we walked through the basement and back out into the woods, through the journals and the ciphers, through the boundary of Weirdmageddon, and into the quiet aftermath of a town